I'm at the age now where I can start talking about things that happened, the way things were in my day. And in my day, if you were to ask somebody, what's your number or what's your type, those kinds of phrases would have a recognizable meaning. What's your phone number? What type of opposite sex member of the opposite sex are you attracted to? Right. So those are what those kinds of phrases meant in my day. But nowadays, those phrases might mean something a little bit different that has nothing to do with phone numbers and what kinds of attractive mates you might be interested in, or at least not entirely that. Instead, those questions may have to do with what's your Enneagram number, what's your Enneagram type. And I'm really excited in today's episode of Theopologetics to be able to host a discussion between two people that I have a lot of respect for, and at least one of them have been friends with for some time, even if we butt heads here and there. And they've both done a lot of research into the topic of the Enneagram, and they've got some really helpful information to share with you, I think. So today we'll be asking the question, is the Enneagram super or snake oil? Hi, this is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Theopologetics. My name is Chris Date, and my guests will be on in a moment after I try and correct their screen presences after somebody messed it up by screwing around with the Skype view settings. But anyway, while I'm trying to do that, I just want to remind you that Theopologetics is part of the Trinity Commission, which is a network of YouTube shows and podcasts that are in some way, shape, or form related to faculty at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where I am an adjunct professor of Bible and theology. So if you're interested in learning informally from people that have a public ministry, but also consider themselves academics and are doing academic work, people like Leighton Flowers of Soteriology 101, and Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett of Trinity Radio, and Tim Stratton of Free Thinking Ministries, and Chris Featherstone, and Steve Gregg, and least of all the apostles, me, of the host of Theopologetics. If you want to learn informally from people like us, because you can't afford the time or the money to get a brick and mortar traditional institution type education, then check out the Trinity Commission. You can just search the Trinity Commission at Facebook, and you'll be able to find more information out there. It's very underdeveloped, that page, but it is something that we're working on. And if you are looking for a formal education, but again, one that fits the kind of needs that in terms of flexibility, both in terms of time and finances, that many of us need nowadays, Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary might be for you. So to learn more, just go to trinitysem.edu. That's TrinitySem, which is short for seminary.edu. Also, just as a way of reminder, it really helps my channel out in all the YouTube algorithms and things like that if you do three simple things. One, like this video after it's over, assuming you did in fact like it. And with the guests that I've got on, I think it'll be hard not to. Number two, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And even if you have subscribed, to make sure you click that notifications bell so that you get alerts whenever I upload new content or start a new stream, schedule even a new stream. If you do all those three things, it will help my channel out and be more exposed to other YouTube viewers and so forth. So that's about all I need to say, I suppose. We'll jump right into the discussion that I've got for you lined up with Jay Medenwaldt and Jeff Cook. Here we go. Awesome. Well, I am super happy to have you guys on the show today. Jay, why don't we start with you? You are a behavioral scientist in the Air Force, or at least you were from 2007 to 2016, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did as a behavioral scientist, how you got interested in that field, those kinds of things?
Yeah, so I was interested in the field of psychology because my mom took a undergrad psychology course when I was a kid. She did it in night school and talked about some of the things that they did in class, and I thought it was just really neat, kind of how the mind was so wonderful and awesome in just unexpected and expected ways, both. And there were often a lot of paradoxes that seemed odd, but once you knew more of the theory and reason behind them, that kind of resolved. And so that's what got me interested in it. And so I majored in psychology while I was at the Air Force Academy, which naturally just led to the field of behavioral science as a career field. And during my time there, I worked and did some, it's probably best described as industrial organizational psychology, so IO psychology. So think of like business type of psychology, looking at personnel selection, how do we train people, things like that. I did that for 4 years, and then they sent me off to get a master's degree, which was a pretty cool job. Go to school full time and get paid, and so I did that. And then once I was done, they brought me back to the Air Force Academy to teach. So I taught there for a little over 3 years as a psychology assistant professor, or I guess terminology would be like an adjunct professor. So that's what I did until I got out of the Air Force.
Awesome, and I'll be asking you
2016.
What you did from there here in a moment. But as you were talking, I had a sudden flood of a memory back when I was 15, 16 years old. I was part of a Marine Corps junior ROTC program at the junior high that I went to. And I remember that one time we went to Fort Lewis McChord Joint Base over here in my neck of the woods. And we had this ranking system where we saw ourselves as Marines up at the top, and then there was the Army, and it was unclear to us which of the other two branches were the girliest of the I'm kidding, but which of the two were the least impressive of the forces, the Air Force or the Navy. So of those two, which one do you think is better?
Yeah, I'll give you the go ahead and say the Air Force is probably the least masculine one, but we pride ourselves in the Air Force as also being the most intelligent. So there's a
very
little
good.
bit of trade-off.
Well, thanks for playing along with that. That was fun. Now, you did something interesting when you left the Air Force in 2016. You transitioned from behavioral science to apologetics and biblical studies, which you studied at Denver Seminary in both a master's degree, an MDiv, and a THM. And then, after that, you began a PhD in social psychology at Baylor. So my question for you is, what got you interested in going to seminary for apologetics and biblical studies, but then what brought you back to sort of psychological type of stuff in your PhD research?
Yeah, so I always had an interest in apologetics since becoming a Christian, because that's what led me to become a Christian when I was in college. And so I loved apologetics, was big into it. And so getting out of the Air Force, the main reason I got out was because I wanted to do probably mission work or at least full-time ministry. And so seminary was a natural progression to prepare to do that. And then thinking maybe overseas missions, but not sure. And so doing that, while I was there, I actually joined a lab, psychology lab at the University of Denver, which is just down the street from Denver Seminary, so that I could continue working in psychology. And during that time, family and life situations came up. It just seemed better to stay in the States and continue in psychology. We adopted a child from foster care, and so we thought it would be better not to get up and uproot her to a different country, and some challenges there, and just also seeing more of a growing need to be a voice in the world of apologetics from a psychological perspective, because there aren't really other psychologists doing apologetics, at least not in like a major focus of theirs. So I figured I'd apply to a psych program and see what happened, and I got in, and so jumped at the opportunity. When someone says they'll pay
Indeed.
You to go to school,
In fact, I often tell people that if I could, I would just earn a living full-time as a full-time student. But unfortunately, that's not something that they typically pay you for. Now, you started a ministry, I think, called Apologetics Awareness. Can you talk a little bit about what you do there and why viewers might want to check it out?
Yeah, so I'm not
okay.
really involved with that anymore, but the idea behind starting that was to just help people become more aware of what apologetics is, because when I became a Christian, I had no idea that there could be evidence for any sort of religious belief. And so the idea of it was just hard for me to get my mind around, and took me a while to accept. And then talking to a lot of other people since then, they've kind of done the same thing. And so the idea behind starting that was to bring more awareness to people that there is, and you can have reason and evidence for faith. It's not just an emotional feeling or a preference. That is a real objective thing. And so wanting to highlight different apologetics ministries, but just as my own ministry has kind of progressed and things like that, it seemed better to transition that to someone that was helping me work on it, Levi Johnston.
Great.
So he's
and then the last question in this introductory part before I switch to getting to know Jeff a little bit, and this is what spawned the conversation that we're having right now, was me posting about this on Facebook. You recently presented at the ETS national meeting, annual meeting, which I think was just like a week ago, right? And by the way, it was incredibly frustrating seeing all my friends on Facebook posting about how great a time they're having at ETS, and meanwhile I was stuck in Atlanta, unable to attend. So that was a bit of a bummer. But anyway, you presented a paper at ETS on the Enneagram, which is the discussion that we're going to be having today. So how did you get interested in the Enneagram? Where did your interest in the topic come from?
So my interest in how I got involved with the Enneagram was through some friends who were using it, and they introduced me to it. And I didn't know what it was. I was a little surprised that I hadn't heard of it before, being a psychologist. And so I listened and learned a little bit from them about what it was. And then when I got home, decided to look up and find out more about it. And so I went to the peer-reviewed journal articles and found that there were very few on it. And then I just wanted to find out whether or not it's accurate or not, and why I hadn't heard about it, because I just finished a master's degree in teaching. So I figured I probably should have heard about this in my own field. And what I came across, all the articles, one were written by people who were advocates of the Enneagram, so they were predicting that it would be successful in their tests. It just wasn't showing good results for what they expected, and based on normal psychological numbers that we look for with the tests that we develop. And so looked that up, didn't look reliable. I was like, okay, that's it, I'm done with that. But then it was just coming up more and more, and realizing that people who were either for or against it, none of them were really talking about any sort of objective evidence for it and its reliability. And so I wrote an article on that on my website, just to get back into kind of doing some blogging. And from there, it kind of has taken off with a lot of different opportunities to write an article for Christianity Today on it, and do work. So some of my dissertation work will be on it. And so just opportunities have kind of come towards me. So I've kind of just walked with it, and it's been enjoyable and fun. And it fits my larger, broader interest, is looking at how we make decisions, and how do we know what's true kind of psychologically, and how can we determine what might be kind of a result of heuristics and kind of misperceptions versus what might really be a real effect.
Awesome.
So this fits
well,
that category.
Look forward to hearing more from you as our conversation continues, but let me turn now to Jeff. Jeff, you and I have been, to some degree anyway, friends for several years now. I think that we first got in touch with each other through my work at Rethinking Hell, because of a book that you published. Do you want to say a word or two about that book? I've even forgotten the title, man. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I did my own Say on Hell in 2009, and it's called Everything New. It was going to get published through Zondervan, and then Zondervan kind of blew up and fired a bunch of people, and my book got kind of cut at the time. So that was my study, and it's still out there on Amazon if you're interested. But
awesome. Well, I encourage people to check that out. And also, I think either I or somebody else on the team interviewed you on the Rethinking Hell podcast a number of years ago. So if viewers, I've kind of got a commitment not to talk about hell on this show. I save that for Rethinking Hell. But if any of you, my viewers, are interested, go check out the Rethinking Hell podcast episode in which I interviewed Jeff, or one of my teammates did. Now, you are a professor of philosophy at the University of Northern Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in philosophy and what what your focus is there, and maybe for viewers that are looking to get a higher education, maybe talk a little bit about why they should consider the University of Northern Colorado.
Sure. Philosophy is the foundation of all knowledge. So you get a PhD, you get a philosophy doctorate in your field because you're studying the epistemology, the metaphysics of your field. Philosophy ends up having those kind of 13,000 feed up kind of questions, and I really get into those specifically, meaning of life, ethics, God's existence, sort of questions. And I've been teaching there since 2005, and Greeley's a great place to be. We try to tell people that it smells a lot here, and that the cost of living is nothing, and you really shouldn't move here because we have a good thing going. But if you're interested in great music and great beer, it is a fantastic place to get an education.
Great. You're also the pastor of a church, Atlas Church, in Greeley, Colorado. For people that are in the Greeley area and who might be looking for a church to call their home, what might you say to encourage them to check Atlas out?
Non-traditional church. It's a church that meets around tables. We have little discussion groups. You can imagine like 50 people meeting and just having time together. We take communion. It's a fairly, it's a creedal church. It's non-denominational. It ends up being more on the progressive side if that was where you landed, but not. That's kind of who we are in terms of the shorthand.
Okay. And same question that I ended my initial discussion with Jay with. Where did your interest in the Enneagram come from? I mean, when in the Facebook discussion that resulted in the conversation we're having now, you said that the Enneagram is the most important tool you have encountered for speaking about your inner life and engaging the hearts of your family. The most important tool is kind of a big, a bold claim. So how did your interest in the Enneagram arise, and how have you developed your interest in it? What have you done with it?
Yeah, I got introduced to Enneagram about 8 years ago, but didn't really get into it until I heard a podcast just off the really flukishly that the person who was on the podcast was describing a person that they cared for who shares my type, and she just began speaking through the way that this person she loved saw the world, engaged the world, and how they struggled. And it just so happened to be the case that at that point in time, I was really in a dark spot, and nearly everything that she was saying was just exposing things about myself that I couldn't have put language to, but the tool that she was using did, and that ended up being a phenomenal place for me to land at that time. Things didn't get easier for many years, but during that season, Enneagram ended up being very valuable in reminding me of the places that I struggle, that people who share my type struggle in those ways, that when engaging relationships with people who are very different and see the world differently, understanding their perspective, where they're coming from in terms of what motivates them and what's most valuable to them. And that ended up being a real healing thing for a lot of the relationships that I was experiencing at the time. And so that's really what infused me with passion for it. And then a buddy of mine and I started a podcast on it about 2 years ago to get deeper into it, give us an excuse to talk about it. And we've been doing Around the Circle podcast for about 2 years.
Great. And I'll make sure at the end of our discussion today to ask you where viewers can go to find that podcast and any other resources that you want to encourage people to check out. Now, Jay, you're going to be kind of the odd man out here for a few minutes. I'm going to be spending a lot of time here initially with Jeff, and it's because I want to give viewers, I want to set the stage for them. I want to give them a good sense of just what the Enneagram is, what it is, or at least what it's alleged to be. And, Jeff is I saw another podcast, I think it was, call him an Enneagram guru. I don't know if how accurate that is, but I'd love for him to help flesh out for us just what the Enneagram is before we start talking about some of your concerns, indeed some of my concerns. So, Jeff, maybe we can just give us a bit of an overview, an introductory summary of what the Enneagram is, and then I'll start asking for some specifics.
Yeah. If you go with me for a second, just going way out, and then we'll get a little tighter. Human motive and desire is really the bedrock for who we are, how we choose to engage the world. Schopenhauer famously said that a man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants. Somehow you are free to do what you desire, but you're not free to choose your desires. Your desires, in some sense, are pre-wired into you. Your motives are pre-wired into you. And having language to talk about your wiring, your motives, your desires, having theories that elevate that element of yourself can be very valuable, especially because so much of who we are, what we do, how we engage the world, our relationships, and the rest come out of that space of motive and desire. And that's what Enneagram seeks to be, it seems. It's a theory about human motivation. And so it's like it seeks to, in some sense, be a map that categorizes how human beings come to the world. It seeks to discover. It's not invented, but it's discovered. It seeks to find patterns in what people who are talking about their motives, seeks to find patterns between these answers and create a picture of what's the map of human motivation. And so just as, we might discover 7 different colors on a spectrum of light, or they're visible to human eyes, or just as we might discover 12 notes in music theory that go around in a circle. This might be a way of understanding how Enneagram works, is we're discovering that when you take all of the human beings across the board, you begin talking to them about their inner life, patterns emerge. And what Enneagram suggests is there's really 9 big motives. There are countless shades of red, just like there's countless shades of each of the types, as it were. But it's a starting place. It's a way of broadly speaking about human motivation. And so that's what Enneagram does. It's a map. It's a map of human motivation.
You used a couple of words there a number of times, desires and motivates, and very often it seems as if advocates of the Enneagram pitch it as a way to identify a personality type, and it's often compared to other personality type models and tests and things. My question for you then is there, do you see there being a relevantly important distinction between a personality map versus a motive map, to use this language that you've been using? And if so, what's the importance of that distinction?
I think what it means to be a human being at this level gets kind of slippery from what is your spirit, your soul, your personality, your motive, your desires, and we could probably add countless others to that mix in terms of what does it mean to be you, what constitutes you. I suppose my gut is something like your motive is part of your personality, just like an engine is a part of a car. Your motive is kind of what makes things go for you.
I see. So it's not that it's inappropriate to call it a way of identifying a personality type. It's just that it's only identifying a certain part of what we would think constitutes a person's personality.
Yeah,
like a subset.
I think your sense of humor.
Traits.
Yeah, your character, your sense of humor. These are not motive, but they're probably part of your personality.
Great. That's actually really good distinction. I appreciate that. Well, I said I'd start asking for specifics, and I want to put some flesh on the bones that you've just sort of erected for viewers. I just, for poops and giggles, because I probably can't swear on a Christian show, I took a free test today to see what type I am. I know that that's probably going to be an inaccurate or at least a somewhat unreliable way of doing it, but I just wanted to see what I was told I am, and what I was told is that I'm a 3, which goes by the phrase the achiever, and there may be other ways of putting that. So, Jeff, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that is indeed accurate, that I am properly identified as a type 3 on the Enneagram. What does that say about me? What kinds of things can I learn about myself, assuming that that's an accurate assessment? Yeah.
It is the case that tests are coin flips. I took a test yesterday for the same reason, just for fun, and got a type that I know I'm not, but that's what it said. So 3s are an aggressive type who demand the attention of others, long to get awards, gold stars, recognition from those in their spheres. 3s are going to solve problems with their head. They're going to focus in on goals and be very goal-oriented. 3s are going to attach to people and jobs that give them the attention that they desire. That may come across as a negative way of phrasing that, but it's not meant to be. 3s are very relational. oftentimes can read the emotions of others very cleanly in order to get what they want. Threes are often people who perform quite well. They're on stage and doing their thing, and others look up to them. Might be a handful of things that constitute many threes. A lot of the language about what does it mean to be a type, again, it's kind of like shades of color. It'll vary from person to person to person, but kind of at the core there, threes want to get the attention of others and are generally aggressive, demanding about getting it. Does that hit you in terms of how you see yourself?
Not the aggressive part, the aggressive demand for it. The way I feel about myself and have for some time is that I very much long, desperately so, for respect and adulation and awards, and I want to be seen as extremely competent, the best at what I do, but I don't think I'm aggressive about that. I don't think I demand it. In fact, very often I don't want to be in the spotlight. So I don't know. As I was looking through what the three allegedly is, there was actually quite a bit there that fits me very well. I'm just not so sure about that aggressive part. Does that answer your question?
How about assertive? Would assertive be a better word for you in terms of getting the attention that you desire?
I don't know. I'm not sure that no, I don't think so. But it may just be how the different ways we're using the word assertive. So,
do you feel like you try and earn other people's attention by being real helpful?
Yes.
We could say some stuff. I mean, it's like all this Enneagram typing can often take a lot of time. Jay and I have gone around in circles on this front, and sometimes the healthiest people, the most mature people, often have the hardest time typing themselves.
Oh, thanks. I'll take that as a compliment. Well, so far, we've talked about what it might mean to fit one of these types that the Enneagram identifies and some of the things that it might say about you, but there's more. As both of you know, the Enneagram also wants to say certain things about me in terms of my relationships with other types. So, for example, and this was all stuff I picked up today, so if I get any of this wrong, Jeff, I'm sorry. But my understanding is that every one of these types has two wings. In the nine, by the way, the word Enneagram, for those of you who aren't aware, means like nine writing, right? It's nine things, a diagram of 9 points. And the Enneagram diagram is like a 9-pointed star. And every number if you imagine like a clock, except instead of 9 hours, or 12 hours, you have 9. There's one of these types at each one of those points. And at any given point, you have a wing to your left and a right, one of the other numbers, one of the other types. In my case, to one side of me is the number 2, the helper, and on the other side is the number 4, the individualist. I'm using the labels that the Enneagram Institute website uses. I don't know if there are better uses than that. But anyway, so unpack the significance of that for me. How do the numbers 2 and 4 on either side of me tell me something about myself as well?
The big idea with the circle is it's just trying to show that the types often are connected in ways that you have a primary center, a primary type through which everything's filtered, but you can balance your life by pulling in some of the tools of the other numbers. Again, this is something that's more discovered than invented. It just so happens that threes can, in order to find balance in their life, push into 4, which has a more introspective side to it, or to 2s who have a much more helping others matter more than myself side to it. And that can help to balance a 3. When the lines start cutting across the circle, I heard one person say it looks like a pentagram having sex with a triangle. What ends up being there is that it's trying to describe that our types often use tools from other numbers when we're in stress or when we're in security. And so 3s will often withdraw when stressed out, when they're unable to solve the problem, not able to move toward the goal. They will almost they'll move out of that primary drive into using different tools, and they're the tools of 9s. 9s are a withdrawn type that just kind of want control over their space. And so in stress, 3s can often reflect 9s, both on the healthy side and the unhealthy side. In security, 3s who have the attention they crave can move more towards 6. 6 ends up being a everybody focused number. And so 3s who are very secure can often begin to elevate the lives of others, to seek other people's successes. So a lot of public speakers who are 3s, a lot of, what do you call those? Like the people who are championing other people to live your best life. Yeah, are often 3s, and they are getting the adulation. I have the microphone. I'm in front of 1,000 people. Now let me tell you about your best life now. That can be moving into a secure space for a lot of 3s. Well, I don't know if that describes you again.
But it kind of does on both counts, maybe. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it more. But it's more. It sounds more like me than I anticipated. Let's put it that way. And for viewers' sake, in case it's not already clear, I'm fairly skeptical of the Enneagram. So Jeff is being very gracious in taking 2 of us on at once. But anyway. So yeah, that does sound like me. Although I'm going to be interested to go and see if I would say the same thing if I were to ask you if I was a 6 or something like that. So anyway, more stuff to research there. But now, so hopefully that gives viewers an idea of what the Enneagram is, and how it's meant to help us to identify what drives us, what motivates us, and how we can engage in better relationships with others. Why do you think that the Enneagram has, in the past, it seems like in the past 5 years or so, has really exploded in popularity amongst evangelical Christians? Why do you think that is?
I think the Enneagram gives great language for talking about sin, that is exposing and potent, and really allows a lot of Christians in the context of their Christian faith to see their sin in a different context. I think that it's become really a lot of folks who are using it at its best use it as a sanctification tool. It's as though you are saying, given my type and my motive, here's where I'm going to struggle. Given my type and my motive, here are the messages that people like me have needed to hear to get from here to there. And so for my own part, for example, my type is a very self-critical type. A lot of my anger goes inward at myself. And so knowing that about myself, giving language to that, and that my where I'm going to struggle is very different from where my wife struggles, very different from where my friends struggle, gives me language for that and allows me to come to the places where I really wrestle with self-destruction and hurting others in a way that has been just quite valuable.
A couple of other thoughts I have, just to see if these are part of the reason why maybe it's growing in popularity. Is there any, do you find people thinking that there's some benefit in their evangelistic efforts, that they're able to connect more with people they're evangelizing or witnessing to if they're better able to understand where they themselves are coming from and where the people they're talking to are coming from? Does that ever come up?
The people that I think are the most mature and healthy in Enneagram circles often display an enormous amount of empathy because of the content. I don't understand what it's like to be fearful. I'm not a fearful person at all. I can understand what it looks like for somebody else to say I'm terrified in the way that I say I'm furious. And so it gives me empathy for the person who struggles with shame or with fear. Those are not the underlying feelings that I experience at high levels. And so that can be good.
Yeah, I could see that. People, there's an old saying that says people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And if you're somebody that is able to exhibit empathy, I could see that being beneficial. The one other thought that comes to my mind is, and Jeff, you being somewhat familiar with my ministry may know that to me, what's one of the things that's most critical is Christian unity between people who agree on the essentials of the faith but disagree on all sorts of other things, including the topic of hell, including the topic of the Enneagram. And one of the things that really grieves me is when I see groups of Christians unable to experience close unity and fellowship. And I wonder if perhaps, assuming the Enneagram has some validity to it, which is something we'll be talking about here momentarily, I could see it being valuable in that regard too. If Christians have a better understanding of their own drives and motivations and what drives and motivates the people that they're fellowshipping with or whatever, it may help them to be more willing to tolerate each other's differences and more willing, in fact, not just to tolerate them, but maybe to see some benefit in those differences as well. So do you think that that's another application of this, is it can help bodies of Christians to be more united and in fellowship with each other?
Yeah, I absolutely think if it were the case that warring factions within the church were able to come to the microphone and say, look, here's the thing, I'm a four, this is how I come to the world, this is where my value judgments are informed, they're out of that space. And so when I make this argument, I'm self-critical enough to realize this is why it's coming from there, or from one space or eight space or whatever. And simply being able to understand, this is one of the big things that's happening right now in terms of the postmodern shift. We are discovering subjectivity, and we're discovering that all truth claims come from places, and that we're making truth claims from our filter, given our language, our background, our whole history, the history of our culture, all wrapped up in ourselves as the filter through which we process information. And so being able to talk about your motive when coming to theology, coming to hell, I mean, I bet you and I could probably talk about why we landed where we did with hell, and I bet you our motive has a lot to do with what attracted us to annihilationism. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's worth saying up front in terms of creating dialogue. So it can be incredibly valuable on those fronts.
Well, very good.
It's even better in church fights. Like this is, as it's actually the case, my church has kind of fallen apart in the last 4 years. We have used this tool over and over again. It got rebooted, but we use this tool over and over again in the midst of real difficult situations to say, at least I understand where you're coming from. I don't come from there, but you come from there, and I want to respect where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So.
Well, if for no other reason than that, I certainly would like the Enneagram to prove to be valid. So we'll start talking about that in a moment. But one last question before I turn things over to Jay for a little bit. It seems as if Christian conversations about the Enneagram that involve skeptics of it like me, they're very often focused on the origins and historical background of the Enneagram. I was really excited, for example, when Justin Brierley on the Unbelievable radio show had Todd Wilson and a critic of the Enneagram on. But the Enneagram skeptic came at it almost entirely from its alleged origins in the New Age and stuff like that. And I'm not actually diminishing or trying anyway to diminish the relevance of that discussion, but that's not what we're going to be focusing on today. So before we do start to turn our focus to where I want to turn it to, do you want to say a word or two in brief in response to the claims that some Christian critics of the Enneagram make, having to do with its origins, it being like occultists in the 20th century invented it, and any claim that it had ancient roots has been made up? What are your responses to that before we move on?
Yeah, I understand where folks are coming from there, because they want to be faithful to Jesus. They want to be not perverted by the world. Some of the things that I think as you become more mature in your study of the Scripture, you'll learn. I assume you hold this, that, for example, the book of Job is a Babylonian story. It's taken by the Jews and put in the text. We could talk about that if you don't want to. I think that's where the scholarship is.
Scholarship has a lot of things wrong, especially in Old Testament scholarship. But anyway, go ahead.
Paul quotes pagan philosophers in Titus.
That he does.
There's lots to be said about the things that we enjoy and lean on most in life. If you were to math and logic are created by the pagans. One of the best arguments for God's existence is the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's an Islamic argument. And are we going to take that and set it aside because it arose from a theology we may not, hold to I think the idea that all truth is God's truth holds real well. I think it's a healthy place to land. You can really, I mean, talking about Christian unity, talking about worldwide unity, when you can affirm where the truth claims of people who are very different from you, I think that's a good, healthy step towards holistic living with people. And if we can't get there, it might be a bloodbath, you know.
All right. Well, for those viewers who were hoping maybe to hear us talk about the allegedly occult origins and stuff like that, sorry to burst your bubble, but that's not the conversation we're going to be having. If you do want to have that or listen in on that conversation, go check out that episode of Unbelievable that I was talking about. They address some of that stuff. Now,
it's a great discussion.
It is a good discussion. And I was frankly interested in what both Todd and the Enneagram skeptic, whose name escapes me, had to say. So I encourage people to check that out. Now, Jay,
she quoted you a bunch, Jay.
What's that?
She quoted Jay a bunch.
Oh, is that right?
It's actually the number one. It's the number one Enneagram episode on Spotify.
Wow.
You get quoted all over. Anyway, if you just look up Enneagram on Spotify, that's the first one that pops up. Anyway.
Well,
fun fact.
Your reputation precedes you, evidently, Jay. So maybe now's a good time to turn to you. And before I start talking to you about the data, just anything from you, any thoughts on you in response to the fleshing out that I just had Jeff do? Do you think he, from your perspective, fairly represented it, or is there anything you'd want to push back on?
Yeah, I think he represented it pretty well, and I would say he's more of the expert on specifically what the Enneagram claims than I am. And for the record, also, the person you're talking about is Marcia Montenegro, who was on Justin Brierley's, and we've corresponded a bit about this. So, yeah, I guess I would like to also say that I love the idea of the Enneagram and everything Jeff described, like if you to get to know yourself and others better so that you can have better relationships and be healthier. Like the idea behind it is wonderful. I absolutely love it. The issue is, does the evidence really match the claims? And that's where I have issues, because I can like an idea, I can like what it stands for, I can like the idea, especially the potential benefit of just being able to empathize with people better. Like I love that so much, but again, I'm going to fall back on where the data goes. And if it makes claims that it can't support, then I'm going to have to say, well, yeah, it claims to do these things, but it's really not. And that's the perspective I'm coming at it from, is like, this is a great idea. I love what it stands for. I love the potential for it, but it just can't really be supported. And that's kind of the bulk of where I'm coming from, because I think what Jeff did say is important about knowing our biases and our desires and where we're coming from is really important, because as objective as we try to be, there always is a degree of subjectivity, and I think we want to be transparent about that and try to minimize that as best as we can. And that's the whole purpose behind science. That's why we do science. The history of science has been, let's put all these claims about people and the universe and everything to the test. And as we've progressed, as science has progressed, we find more and more a lot of claims that people held in the pre-scientific age weren't fully true, or were partial truths, or got some things right. And so as we test these ideas, we get more and more knowledge, and we see things more clearly and accurately in a way that's more objective, where I can test something, Chris, you could test it, Jeff, you could test it, we could come up with different ways of testing it, and we're all probably going to come up with pretty similar results. And that's what's great about science and how we do it, is that level of objectivity. Obviously, there's still some subjectivity to it. There's type 2 and type 1 errors, so just by coincidence sometimes you're going to get effect or no effect when there really is or isn't one. So just a statistical coincidence, sometimes that happens, which is why we try and get big sample size and we repeat things. But that's, I think, really important to this conversation, because the Enneagram makes lots and lots of claims, and there's not really support.
And we'll start digging into that, but maybe a good place to start with is, what is the scientific community's overall impression of the Enneagram? I say that there's value in starting there, even though I am one of those outdated scientific people you probably had in mind a moment ago, because I'm a young Earth creationist. And so right off the bat, my claim to say it's worth asking what is the scientific community's impression of something is going to raise red flags in some people's minds. But I continue to hold to young Earth creationism because I don't think that the scientific community has it right. I've investigated some of their claims. So it's not like I'm saying that the scientific consensus, to the extent there is a consensus, is the de facto way to test a claim like this. But I do think it's a good place to start. So can you tell us... actually, you know what? I've skipped ahead of my own questions here. I'll come back to that in a moment. Before I ask you that question I was just about to ask, with such a nice setting it up too. Jeff, you have said in your conversation with Jay that I've listened to, and on the Facebook conversation we had, that the Enneagram is a theory similar to other theories and needs to be addressed or assessed as such. That the Enneagram should be considered falsifiable in similar ways that other theories would be able to be disproved. So before I start getting into these questions that I want to ask Jay about, do you have any objection to the claim that this is something we can assess scientifically, that we can measure and falsify using the scientific data? Because to my understanding, there are a lot of people that are advocates of the Enneagram that say, no, you can't. In fact, I think I was going to ask Jay about that, and I'll return to him in a moment about that. So do you think it's legitimate to examine, to test the claims of the Enneagram scientifically?
Shorthand is, I would love to see more research, scientific research on Enneagram, and I would love to see what's produced. I'm actually trying to fund that at our school right now, so we'll see what comes of that. I know it's the case that, Jay said this a little bit ago, that there's very few peer-reviewed articles, and that's been my experience as well. And given not only the popularity, but how meaningful it appears to be to so many, it seems like there's all sorts of PhDs that could get written on this. Psychology, so I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher. Psychology strikes me as a soft science. It's about the human psyche, which is immaterial. And so there is an element to it. It's not hard science where I'm putting this chemical with this chemical and there's repeatability. There's all sorts of stuff going on with, and obviously Jay can speak more to this in terms of the methods of truly fantastic psychologists in terms of assessing data. I hold that in my mind this theory, Enneagram, has explanatory power for a lot of us, and that we've had real connection to it. Falsifiability would entail one of two things then. One, you would either pitch a theory that's much, much better in explaining human motive, or two, you would show anomalies. Here are things that ought to be there that aren't. And a lot of the things that I've heard Jay wanting to do kind of go down that road of, it should be the case that if Enneagram was true, we should see X, Y, and Z, and we don't. So those are two ways that a scientific theory can be falsified.
Well, so now I'll come back to you, Jay, and ask the question that I accidentally skipped over, and then I'll ask you the question I started to tee up and then so miserably failed at. Why do some advocates of the Enneagram say it can't be falsified scientifically? And what would you say in response to that claim?
I can't really speak for everyone, so I want to be careful here. But typically what I find, so unfortunately I went into two fields that everyone thinks they know something about: psychology and theology. You go and ask someone on the street, like, hey, what do these other religions believe, or what is true about Christianity? And people are going to talk to you like they're an expert and they know. And you ask them about humans and the way humans are and the way that we think and behave, they're going to give you the same thing. And there's actually a term for this. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. When people know a small amount about a subject, they have very high confidence in something and think they're very right. And as they actually start to attain real higher levels of expertise, their confidence actually shoots way down before they reach kind of a intermediate type of level, and it starts to go back up. And so I think a lot of the reason why people say it's not testable,
it's not appropriate. This isn't that sort of conversation. I cut you off. That's
No, that's a high horse of mine, so I'm with you on that. But I think a lot of the reasons why people say it's not testable is just because they don't know how to test things psychologically and what psychologists do and how they test these things. And when I first wrote my first article on the Enneagram, I had a friend or acquaintance, I guess, and she was a therapist. So she had a counseling degree, so not a full psychology kind of clinical psych degree, but she had a counseling degree, a master's degree, and she was disturbed by my article because she was a big fan of the Enneagram. And so she's at a fairly high level, and we sat down, and one of the things she said was that it can't be tested. So how can you know it's not true? And I said, well, name a single claim that it makes that can't be tested. And she named a few, and we went through, and I told her exactly very easily how it could be tested, and how the way that you would test it is very similar to, or exactly the same as, lots of other things psychologists test very regularly. So I think that's a big part of it, is just people really who claim that it can't be tested don't know what psychologists do or how they test it. And that's probably where it comes back from. I don't think there's any sort of ill intent or deception going on for most of them. I just think it's just they don't have advanced degrees in psychology. So
that makes a lot of sense. I thought that the reason why some were claiming it's not testable is I didn't think they were being deceitful. I thought maybe it was because maybe there's a little more new aginess to this than it actually has. I thought maybe they were thinking there's something esoteric or magical about it, but no, that actually makes sense. I understand why people might misunderstand there. Okay, so now let me get to that question I was trying to tee up about the scientific consensus. I think this is a good place to start. It's by no means the finish point, especially given what you both have acknowledged, that there's not a lot of peer-reviewed research on the topic. But to the extent that the scientific community, number one, can be spoken of as a community, and number two, has a general, an opinion that is held by a large percentage of that community, what is the scientific consensus, or at least the prevailing opinion from the scientific industry when it comes to the validity of the Enneagram?
Yeah, and so before I answer, I just want to make a little caveat in just understanding and recognizing how science works. Because when you test something scientifically, you go out and you look for evidence for it and you test it, and different fields work a little differently. But within psychology, we're going to go out and we're going to devise a test, and we're going to test it, and then we'll report our results. And so in this case, the results, it's hard to argue with the results. It's kind of like if you're walking through the desert and you're picking up rocks. The results are like those rocks. It's really hard to argue, and there can, because you can get into methodological things. But if you pick up rocks and they have fossils in them, it's really hard to argue against the fact that you're holding rocks and that those are probably fossils. The issues that come in later with critiquing and arguing with science often comes from when we put all the evidence together, right? All those just pure results. What conclusions do we draw from that? In psychology papers, that's going to be what's called the discussion section. So we'll explain in our paper, here's the theory behind what we're doing, here's what we actually did, here are the results. There's not a whole lot to disagree with there. And then when you say, well, therefore, right, that's the discussion section. Here's what we found, therefore, that's where there gets to be a lot of confusion and misunderstanding and disagreements as far as what the evidence means. And I think that's important to caveat, especially as you bring up like young earth creationism and things like that. That's where a lot of that disagreement is. And so I don't think we need to distrust science in really any way as far as what the peer results are, what the actual evidence is. It's the interpretation of that evidence or the conclusions drawn. And so doing that, and a lot of the studies that have looked at the Enneagram, they're not really getting much into the therefore yet, because a lot of it is so fundamental level. So it's just basically, let's test these people and let's find out very simple, straightforward, like, are these experts agreeing with people even what someone's type is, or how to determine a type, or things like that. And so it's pretty basic, low level. And so those are pretty clear, but they're both anecdotally, and there was a study on this. In general, the psychologists who are aware of it kind of laugh at it. There are a handful of them who like it and use it, so it's not like it's completely unanimous. But for the most part, when I've asked people at conferences, they kind of laugh about it. It's like, yeah, I wish that thing would go away. There was a paper that asked a bunch of people about their views of a whole bunch of different kind of psychological tests and metrics, and the Enneagram was the second least reliable according to them. And so the community of psychologists, for the most part, seem pretty heavily in agreement that it's not very reliable.
I'm looking at the authoritative source of all knowledge, Wikipedia, and it says that in a Delphi poll of 101 doctoral level members of psychological organizations like the APA, the Enneagram was among 5 psychological treatments and tests which were rated by at least 25% of them. So at least 25% of these doctoral level psychologists rated the Enneagram as being discredited for personality assessment. Experts familiar with the Enneagram rated it with a mean score of 4.14, which is approximately an equivalent to the option probably discredited, or perhaps even worse, certainly discredited. So would you say that that view of the Enneagram's validity is probably the norm among scientifically trained psychologists and so forth?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty normal. Again, there are a handful of people, especially as you get outside of personality psychology and you start to stray into maybe more clinical psychologists who don't really focus as much on psychometrics and more of the that sort of research, or IO psychologists, so industrial organizational psychologists who are more in the business world. They're more likely to use it, from what I've seen, than, say, a personality psychologist or social psychologist who specializes in kind of the development and assessment of different metrics.
Well, let's talk about some of those metrics, the kinds of tests or ways of analyzing the validity of the Enneagram that you talk about in your articles at your website. I've count at least 4 such types of evidences, and I want to talk to you about them each in turn, just so that viewers can get a sense of what kinds of things lead many in the psychological scientific community to have the opinion that we just discussed. One of those kinds of tests or lines of evidences that you've talked about, one of those metrics is called test-retest reliability. So what is test-retest reliability, and how do you, based on what research you've looked at, how does the Enneagram fare in light of test-retest reliability?
Test-retest reliability is if I give you the test right now, and if I test you again at some later date in the future, how strongly correlated are your scores? And that can range from testing you, 2 different days versus 6 months or a year later or whatever. So it varies. And what is the standard level of acceptable is different based on the time frame, because there is an expectation, especially with personality tests, that there will be some changes over time. But with the Enneagram, and even with what Jeff said, that the Enneagram, your type is set. It's predetermined and you can't change it, and it's just who you are. And so we would expect with the Enneagram there should actually be higher test-retest reliability than what is typically called for based on norms of other types of tests. So usually you're looking at around 70 or 80% the same type of score as being kind of good or acceptable. But based on Enneagram theory, if you don't change types, then we would expect even higher scores, because there shouldn't be that natural variation of change over time. It should be set. So it should just come down to kind of measurement error, where sometimes you might just be in a different mood, or maybe the question was worded in a kind of weird way that didn't make sense to you, and so you read it a little different one time than when you took it another time. So those types of things that psychologists kind of look at and measure as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a test like a scale. It can be a rater. So if Jeff types you, Chris, after getting to know you, and then types you again in 6 months, hopefully without remembering who you are, it would be a little difficult as someone he knows well. But doing that with a lot of people is he typing you the same way over time. So those would be essentially what test-retest reliability is. And the scores for the Enneagram are all way lower than the standard norms expected. As I said, like the 0.7, 0.8.
Can you footnote that, Jay, real quick?
And
like what research,
yeah,
what
what
study or studies are you referring to that resulted in those numbers you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I've got it pulled up here. So Wagner. So Wagner's got his version of the Enneagram. He tested it. I'm trying to look through the different types that I tested or where I wrote it. So Wagner and Walker, it was one of the original studies on it in 1983. So Wagner's been doing this for almost 40 years.
Okay.
With
I did
the
read that
Enneagram.
article.
His correlation.
I read that article. Go
What was
ahead.
that? Yeah, so his correlation between pre and post test is correlated from a range for the different types from 0.17 to 0.78 with an average of 0.53. So that's on the very, very low
Can I
end.
speak to that real quick?
Sure.
It's again the case.
Yeah, go
Enneagram
ahead.
theory is it. A lot of folks who affirm Enneagram theory want to say it's very, very old. It's not. Like a lot of the work has been done in the last 20 years. 1983 is super early for things that have been discovered, written about. I would be skeptical just based. It's like judging scientific studies from 1689 on, the curvature of the earth. There may be some stuff. There's the assumptions, the way that things are being articulated, how you type people, how you articulate your problems. I would be hesitant there because Jay and I have had this conversation before. We're right at the beginning, in my mind, in terms of theorizing about Enneagram. I think that it's the wild, wild west, and all the folks who are writing on this know it because they all want copyrights. And you see them elbowing each other, trying to get position in terms of language and the rest because nothing's been solidified. But let me say, here's what we're going to critique.
Well, hold on,
Jay,
before
there on this front.
Yeah, before you come back on that, Jay, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question of Jeff. I hear what you're saying about us still being in the very early stages, possibly, arguably, of Enneagram research and so forth, and I get that. And that certainly, I can understand why that might call into question Jay's expectation that the reliability would even be higher than other kinds of tests because the theory is that the Enneagram type is innate. So I would get that. But are you saying that because we're at those early stages, that could actually be part of the reason why the reliability score is so low is because how to assess somebody's type is still something that's being worked out? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, your study is only as good as your assumptions.
Okay.
I mean, what's getting plugged into the model? How's it being articulated? How are you actually engaging with the people that you're studying? I don't know. I would assume what I've read from books in 1983 versus what's being published in the last 10 years is very different. So just to put a quick, psychology itself is a very new discipline. I study, you and I, Chris, we study 3,000-year-old texts. The rate of change in terms of how psychology has progressed as a field in the last 100 years is moving 1,000 miles an hour. And your assumptions coming to psychology itself matter. Are you just a brain? Are you an electrochemical machine? Or do you have something that we might call a mind? Do you have something that's immaterial to yourself, and how does that affect your physicality and how you engage the world? What does it look like for your brain to interact with your mind? All of these things are likewise very, very difficult to put your thumb on. And all I'm saying here is that this would be one of the places I might pause and say, since there are very few peer-reviewed articles, especially in the last 8 years, there's really almost nothing. Yeah, I would just be real cautious with that kind of data.
Well, I understand, and I think that what I'm looking to see is what the cumulative case is, not just any one particular data point. And just as a side note, just in support of what you said about psychology itself being a fairly young discipline, for better or for worse, I associate psychology, the beginning of it really flourishing with Phineas Gage, and we're talking mid-19th century. Is there any appropriateness to Jay to identifying the start of the psychological study with Phineas Gage? I just remember because he's that guy who had the railroad spike shot through his head and it totally changed his personality, right?
Yeah, so that would probably be a step along the way, but probably just before, just after 1900 is usually where it really started to take off, specifically as a science, so progressing beyond where Freud was essentially just doing philosophy, and much of what Freud said was not really accepted. But after that, a lot of the field has progressed as a science. So instead of theorizing about things, it's let's test it, let's test it, let's test it. And so coming up with ways to test it. Phineas Gage is an example of kind of a natural experiment where something happens by accident, and psychologists can study him or cases like his to see what effects it has. And so, yeah, I mean, it is fairly new in that sense. It has developed a lot, and a 30-year-old study is often considered out of date, as Jeff pointed out. But I would say that, and two things with that is the newer data shows general agreement with that, and the reason why newer things are considered, or older things like that are often considered out of date, is because theories become more robust, so that there gets to be more nuance, better understanding of things. We know things a little better, and so broad brush statements that have been done on studies 30, 40, 50 years ago, even 10 years ago, maybe are still somewhat accurate, but just not nuanced like we would have now. And in this case, I would say if that study from Wagner, which again matches some of the other studies that are newer, is not to be considered reliable, or that the Enneagram theory has grown a lot since then. I think there's two issues with that. Is one, in our previous conversation, Jeff talked about how one of the things about the Enneagram and why he thinks it's so good is because it's withstood the test of time. I assume he meant thousands of years ancient origins, which is not true about its origins. There's a video you can find. Okay, well, it's something I took down in my notes from what you said, that it's withstood the test of time. And so maybe you don't stand by that anymore, but Claudio Naranjo, who worked with Oscar Acaso in developing it, flat out says that they made up the ancient origins to give it credibility. And so it's really only 50 years old, which that's not relevant for is it true. It's relevant for just the fact that, to point out that it hasn't withstood the test of time. And then if it hasn't really been tested and it is still being fleshed out, why is life-giving or life-saving advice being given based on this thing that really, just admitted, it hasn't really been fleshed out very well yet, and probably isn't correct?
Do you want to come back on that a little bit, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that have been discovered in the last 20 years that have brought huge value and benefit to humanity. I'm not sure that discredits them. The origin, we've talked about this in the past. A lot of the stuff that it seems like you're mentioning with Naranjo and the rest is a genetic fallacy. Doesn't matter where it came from. You and I are coming to the world, the real world, and we're saying, what does this world look like? All I'm saying is human beings have motives.
But Jeff,
I agree with that. I agree completely. That's the genetic fallacy. But if someone wants to claim it's withstood the test of time because it's thousands of years old, then it just goes to that. Just to that statement. If someone wants to make that claim about the Enneagram,
that language,
that's
so
it.
Let's just set that aside because it's a moot point. It doesn't matter.
Okay, moot point for you, yes, but just anyone who might be listening.
What my claim was is that it seems to me that Enneagram theory itself is moving very quickly. There are some bones there for sure. But it seems to me that there's a lot going on in terms of creating the systems, and there's lots of disagreement within the Enneagram community itself about how it works and what's most essential in the rest. And all I'm saying is this is a problem for us, as it were. It's not necessarily, it's hard for you to do an assessment of Enneagram when there's a moving target and it hasn't been grounded yet. And I'm real sorry about that. But in my mind, that's actually where we're at. And I'm pretty knowledgeable in terms of what the discussion is now. And I'm just saying it might be very difficult to hit this target, especially given 1983 literature on the topic.
Excuse me. Well, let's continue then to talk about the other elements in that cumulative case that I mentioned a moment ago, because this retest reliability is only one thing that Jay talks about in his article that he read at ETS. Another kind of reliability measurement is called inter-rater reliability. So, Jay, can you talk about what inter-rater reliability is and how the Enneagram fares in light of that test?
Inter-rater reliability would be if you test two raters to see if they agree. So if Jeff and I type someone, do we agree? If my test and Jeff as a person type someone, are they agreeing? Are two Enneagram experts agreeing on how to type someone? Is self-typing agreeing with a scale that's used, or is an expert who's typing someone? So any sort of comparison with how someone is being typed is what that score.
And how does the Enneagram hold up?
Yeah,
Jeff,
go ahead.
You want to say something?
I think you can answer that question. I would like to critique that approach to Enneagram itself.
Okay, but yeah, once again, dismally poor. One study, so this is 2001, which they also found low retest reliability, but only 42% of people were classified by the two scales the same way. Another one in 2020, so 2020, found that the agreement between two scales virtually were non-existent. It was almost zero between typing people the same. So, and there's a few other ones. There's a recent meta-analysis done in 2020 as well that cited some of these different studies, and just very low agreement between how different people or different scales or self-assessments, how they type a person.
Jay, so just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, let's say that, we just talked about how I typed myself today as somebody who's not trained in it. And then let's say that Jeff and I didn't know each other and we were to talk and he were to give me a number. And then let's say I went to some other Enneagram expert and they talked to me and they ended up coming up with what type they think I am. Am I to understand you correctly as saying that there's a decent chance that each of those three people, myself and the two raters, would probably identify me, or just in terms of the numbers that you've looked at, there's a pretty decent chance that I'd get two or three different results from those three different people that I mentioned? Is that what you're getting at?
Most likely, yeah. And the reason that's a problem is because if there are these clear types where people really fit into a single type, there should be more consistency between different people rating it.
All right. So, Jeff, I know that you wanted to push back on whether it's appropriate, whether it's helpful to measure the validity of the Enneagram in this way. Explain why. What's your concern there?
Yeah, there's a prescriptive claim that Jay had in there that's important. It should be the case that outside observers should be able to talk authoritatively about the inner life of other people. And that just seems to me to be false. Let me ask the two of you, am I experiencing emotional pain right now?
I don't know. I can't tell.
Don't know.
You could ask me questions on this front, and I could give you responses, and you can't tell. But that's how motive works, is only a person actually knows how they're motivated. It can be I find this very difficult in my own work with Enneagram. Sometimes it's simply difficult to engage folks and say, here's how the system works. You come to the world with a motive, with a set of glasses through which you process everything. And I can try and lead people to say, does the world look like this? Is this how your desires function? But sometimes it can be enormously complicated. Human beings are enormously complicated. And it's just how the world is. And getting into the head of somebody, when you're a specialist and they're a person, especially if they have layers, pain, of trauma, of maturity, of ways of combating the places where they struggle and where they live in excess. These are all things that factor into typing well. And I just want to pause on this one and just say, it really is the case on all of these scientific assessments. The evidence is only as good as the person who's conducting the test is at actually entering into the mindset, desires, and motives of another human being in this exact way. And so if you're not a specialist, one, in Enneagram in the first place, or two, even for specialists, I think it can be incredibly difficult. So I will pitch what I think Jay said, like, this is what we should expect. expect. I would give you a big list of things I think we should expect, that if you want to do scientific studies, here are some places that strike me as worthwhile. But
well, let's hold on that. I do want to come back to that. That is something I think I'm intrigued by and that I think would be worth discussing. But I just want to say, while I hear what you're saying about somebody who's not a specialist isn't going to be able to type well as somebody who's a specialist, and most people who are specialists are still going to plausibly come up with different types just because they have different approaches, there's a whole, I get it, people are complicated, but it seems to me that if you got enough really expert raters together, who have established track records of success with people, it would seem like you would be able to see some sort of correlation between the different people's rates, and that's something I'm gathering we're not yet seeing. But the other thing I'll say is, let's say that it is,
and that's also an assumption about the study. It just is. It's an assumption about who's conducting the study, what's in the study, how this is processed, etc. I mean, there's a lot going on here. I think the big claim, there are very few peer-reviewed articles, really is important to our discussion. That's where we're at.
So I'll say on that front, so the peer-reviewed articles that have been done on it, again, have all been done by people who like the Enneagram, are advocating for it, with the one exception, and some of them are even what would be considered experts, so have written books on it. So Jerome Wagner, he's published 2 studies on it, plus he has a manual for his test that reports a lot of the data. David Daniels, another one, also done 2 studies on it and testing it. And all of these tests, even by these experts,
I read the Daniels study. He was really positive. I don't know where you were seeing the negative there. I have the quote here if you want to hear it, in terms of what his conclusion was.
Yeah,
Daniels, Dr. David Daniels.
Because I know, because there's issues with that. I'll just let you know so you're not caught off guard. I say because there's issues with that. I'm pretty sure I know where you're going with this. So just to give you a heads up so you're not caught off guard, because I don't think you read the studies in detail and understood the statistical analysis.
Conclusion from Dr. David Daniels, 30 years clinical professor of psychiatry at Stanford. The Enneagram has been rapidly expanding in both psychotherapy and organizational development. We see businesses loving this stuff. However, the proliferative nature of its application is not mirrored in the sphere of psychological research and discourse. That seems fairly authoritative, and it goes with exactly what you said before, that there are very few peer-reviewed articles. He footnotes 2 studies, but speaking that established that there's just not a lot of work. Speaking of his own peer-reviewed study, Daniel concludes this. He says, given the promising results of this study and widespread use of the system, the time is ripe for further empirical research. Why? Because there ain't none. Like most theories, the Enneagram's origin lie in the realm of assimilated wisdom and personal experience. However, it would be beneficial for the Enneagram community to expand upon the current paucity of research and more fully enter the realm of scientific inquiry. That is as authoritative as you can get in terms of somebody who is deeply interested in Enneagram, saying there just isn't enough study to say much about this right now, and it's time for us to step up. I mean, that's actually him saying, gee, I wish other people would come around and do exactly the sort of work that you're asking for. So when we're talking about the scientific community, Chris, the scientific community may have all sorts of biases towards the Enneagram, but there's no studies out there, and it would be authoritatively, those who are in the midst of this are saying there's just nothing there to make a full assessment on. That's where I read it, and I don't see any reason why that's a problem right now. The theory is being developed, it's really new, and that's where we're at.
Jay?
So Daniel's is a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists don't, again, specialize in psychometrics and measurement assessment and that type of stuff. So he's speaking in that way as a non-expert, so someone outside his expertise. Which again,
but Jeff,
right? I know, but I'm just
Jay might be able to explain this a little bit better than I can. But psychiatry and psychology, although they are similar to each other, they're fundamentally different disciplines, right? I mean, it's in the very etymology of those words. Psychology is the study of the psyche or of the mind, but psychiatry is the healing of the mind. It's therapy, and it's about, so at least arguably, if Daniel is indeed more of a psychiatrist than a psychologist, it may be that he's not really speaking in his field of expertise.
He's commenting on the literature.
But literature that he may not be as equipped to assess.
This is his field!
Not if it's psychiatry, because we're talking psychology here. Anyway, sorry, Jay, you go ahead and you give a much better answer than I could.
No, I mean, I'll agree with Jeff that there isn't a lot on it, but there's enough that all agrees with each other. Like every test that it's put to, it fails. It fails every single time. So out of the 20 or so studies and the 100 dissertation and thesis projects, it fails over and over again. So there's not a lot, but there's still.
It just is. That's bad research, Jay. You know it.
Well, hold on, Jeff. I mean, let's
the Daniel study. So I'm guessing you got your quote from Daniel's 2018. So the article's titled "Advancing Ego Development in Adulthood Through Study of the Enneagram System of Personality." So in that study, they set up two different groups: a short-term Enneagram training group as a control, and a long-term, more intensive Enneagram training group as the experimental condition. And so their hypothesis was that the intensive group, the group that did more training in the Enneagram, would have more positive benefits in ego development than the control group. Okay? What they found when they compared that, no difference. The test failed. But what they did afterwards, and where that quote comes from that says, "This sounds promising," is where he looked, and now he pulled apart those two groups and divided them into 7 groups based on the location. And out of the 7 groups, he found one group that had a positive growth pre and post test, and he reported on that, and that there was a growth. No comparison to a control, no correcting for error, so type 2 error, so the chance of getting a positive result when you do multiple tests. He's not talking about the one group that had a negative trend that went in the opposite direction. There's no control group that did nothing during that time and wasn't doing any sort of Enneagram training. And so from 1 out of 7 groups, after failing his main hypothesis, he's saying that they found partial support for their theory. That's just bad science, period. There's no other way to say that. That's what we have a term for that. It's called phishing or p-hacking, which is part of the issue with scientific studies, where you're not getting the proper controls and comparisons, and you're not getting the sample size, and you're doing multiple analysis. If you do enough analysis on enough things, you can find something that is statistically significant, so something that looks like an effect. And that's essentially what he did in this article to kind of, I don't know why, so I'm not going to go there, but that's what he did.
It's in the case. The primary point I'm saying is exactly what you said opening our show. There's very few peer-reviewed articles. It seems to me that saying that the scientific community believes X about the Enneagram is just feels like a terrible conclusion. There isn't enough here. I looked at every article that you've footnoted and everything on your website. It just doesn't feel like there's enough there to say anything of value. Well, you can say this is the beginning. This is some stuff that we started with. Here are some of the places that we're going. This is some of the early things that we found. I just want to caution, man. It just doesn't feel like there's enough evidence to say anything authoritatively.
So then why do you get to make positive claims about it authoritatively without any evidence?
Well, hold on. We're going to get to Jeff's evidence, because right now we've been focusing on the scientific data, but here shortly we're going to be turning to Jeff's own personal experience with it and the experience of many others. And I think that he might say that's where some of his evidence is going to be coming from. So I don't want to jump the gun too quickly. But here's, as somebody that's trying to fallibly moderate what is turning into a very lively discussion, which I think is awesome, and somebody who, although skeptical of the Enneagram, is nevertheless interested and wants to be convinced if it's valid. It sounds to me like what we're saying so far is, yes, there's not a lot of scientific data yet to base conclusions on, but what evidence there is when the science is actually being done acceptably is fairly unanimous in its negative assessment of the Enneagram and its results. And I will admit, Jeff, that if I've just characterized the state of affairs accurately, that what little evidence there is nevertheless virtually unanimous in saying the Enneagram is unreliable. that does make one in my position wonder, well, how many more studies do there need to be that continue to confirm this before we say, okay, there maybe really is something to be concerned about here? So I'm just saying that's kind of where I'm coming from at this point.
Yeah. We mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect earlier. It feels like that. I mean, it just feels like the sort of topics that those who are doing studies that are listed in the footnotes of Jay's material, it just doesn't feel like it's getting very far in terms of what ought to be studied, what ought to be analyzed. If I was overseeing this, and again, I'm not a scientist, so maybe I'm naive here, but my topic, the places that I'm going would simply be different, and that's just my naive assessment. I think saying the scientific community thinks this, or it's been discredited, it just simply isn't warranted right now. It could be the case that it's negative. I mean, here's the thing. All three of us believe in God's existence. All three of us know that the Holocaust took place. We had a worldwide pandemic, and we know that children die of brain cancer. That appears to prove that a God doesn't care about humanity. And not one of us think that those proofs actually hold because there are other things worth saying. Long story short, it just seems like there's not enough here in terms of the way that I think of the theory. And I'm an academic, and I can speak authoritatively of that.
Yeah.
How many studies would you say
I think that it would be, it's not really the number, it really would be like, here's how the studies are conducted. This is what we are trying to measure. Here's the number of people that we're looking at research. I think that's a great question. But again, if you're going to say the scientific community believes this, I imagine it would take, you would want, I mean, I'm sure it's the case that there's 80 studies out there about why people prefer Snickers to M&Ms. There's just not that sort of literature on Enneagram, it seems like.
Well,
that's an assumption, by the way. But
I want to come back to Jeff in a moment, but before we do, Jay, I do want to give you a chance to just briefly mention the two other kinds of evidences that you talk about in your article. One is called internal consistency reliability, and the other is predictive validity. Just really quickly, to wrap up this part of our discussion, what are internal consistency reliability and predictive validity, and how does the Enneagram, in what limited studies there have been done, how does the Enneagram fare in light of those kinds of tests?
Yeah, so internal reliability or internal consistency is a measure. So if I develop a scale, it's basically saying if all the questions for type 1, are they relatively being scored in the same way? The questions for type 2s, are people relatively scoring the same way in that? And basically looking at, it's a measure of whether the types, in this case, all go together to a high degree. And again, in that, the scores fall terribly low. The cutoff minimum is usually considered about 0.7. Maybe if you have a big test like the Enneagram, like maybe a type or so falls below that. But with most of the Enneagram studies, it's falling much below that 0.7 mark. And so really what that's showing is that the types, there's not really distinct types. The types are all kind of blended together and not really fully capturing someone. And then validity is kind of separate from reliability. Predictive validity is just one type of validity, and what that's basically looking at is there some sort of predictive utility to it. So if we draw conclusions, this should be the case based on the Enneagram or whatever test we're using. If we make a prediction about it, is that showing up? Is that what we find? And again, when the Enneagram is measured, it's not doing very well in that compared to the different hypotheses that were tested or compared to other tests such as the Big Five. It kind of falls short again. And even one test by, again, Daniels thought that he hypothesized that twins would have a higher rate of the same type than non-twins, and what they found is there was no difference that would be different than chance, which disagrees from all the psychological literature on the heritability of personality, which includes motivation and things of that sort. And so that was just one of the several ways that kind of disconfirmed what an Enneagram expert who's written a book on it thought would be the case about the Enneagram. And I say also the Enneagram Institute on their website refers to some of these studies and says that their test has been scientifically validated, and they worked with the doctoral student who helped them develop that test as
you were
well.
about to say?
Yeah, I mean, just speaking of that's a good example. The twins example is a good example of what I'm talking about in terms of, I mean, that feels so nuanced. And what does it prove? It proves that twins don't share similar Enneagram types. And then the assumption is plugged in, well, since they have the same genetic, makeup, then they ought to. Well, that has all sorts of metaphysical assumptions on it. Like, my metaphysical assumption is those are two fundamentally different people who might reflect the living God in different ways and have different struggles, different ways they come to the world, different motives that aren't influenced by their biochemistry. That actually is a fantastic argument for something that exists, for a mind that exists apart from your physicality. That says nothing about the Enneagram. That says something about Dr. David Daniels' assumptions about whether or not twins would have the same Enneagram type, and clearly he said, gee, they don't.
And so, yeah, I mean, I would agree with you if there's something metaphysical there. The issue is that every other study that looks at personality and the heritability of it finds there's some effect, that there's twins are more likely to have similarities. So those other studies, hundreds or thousands of them probably, looking at the heritability of personality traits or including motivations and desires, they find that twins are more likely to be similar or have more similarity than non-twins.
Your assumption is
why didn't the Enneagram do that?
Unless your theory of human motive has as part of its evidence is this assumption about how twins' motives will work, then it's discredited. Is that right?
I'm not quite sure, but what I'm saying is all the other research that is similar and tests this same thing shows that twins are more likely to be similar. And so if the Enneagram is testing the same or similar construct,
Jay, let me
expect
ask a clarifying question there. Put the Enneagram aside and talk about other kinds of personality or personality-related measurements, traits that get measured. Is it the case that on other studies that aren't related to the Enneagram, they do find a higher than normal, higher than average similarity between twins than in the general public on, say, their interests, their whatever, I don't know. Is it the case that usually there is more correlation among twins and there's not with the Enneagram? Is that what you're saying?
Right, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So the Big Five is the most commonly used test of personality, and it gets at kind of the traits of personality. It doesn't get at all parts of personality, but gets at the traits. And we see, so for instance, conscientiousness is often talked about. We see high degree of agreement between twins on conscientiousness. And I bring that one up specifically because according to the Enneagram theories, all the ones I've read, because I use this as an example, they all agree that type 1s are highly conscientious. Okay, well, if that's what characterizes type 1s, and all the other literature shows that twins are, one twin who's highly conscientious is more likely to have another twin who's highly conscientious. If the Enneagram, if type 1s of the Enneagram are highly conscientious, we should see a correlation, higher correlation between twins who are type 1s.
So Jeff,
and we don't see that.
It sounds to me like what Jay is saying is, look, okay, well, let me say it for the viewer's sake then, or to make sure I understand. So it seems to me as if whatever one's anthropology, I mean, you guys may or may not know that I'm a non-reductive physicalist, and so every time Jeff waxes eloquent about an immaterial soul, I'm sitting here biting my tongue. But nevertheless, putting that aside and granting the possibility that God may create unique souls that are different regardless of the genetic makeup of the body that embodies the soul, regardless of whatever upbringing the person experiences, either way, the fact remains, or so it sounds like to me, when it comes to other kinds of personality measurements, you do find a greater than average correlation between twins, which would suggest, at least on the surface, that even if God creates immaterial souls that are distinct from one another, that aren't affected by genetic makeup, etc., nevertheless, there is an element to personality that is affected by upbringing and genetics, things that twins are going to share in common. So why don't we see that similar kind of thing in the with the Enneagram? I think that's what Jay's getting at.
Given my metaphysic, everything Jay said actually proves exactly what I would expect. That is, that human beings are fashioned uniquely, and it doesn't matter if they come from the same,
But what about the other personality measurements where they do find that correlation amongst twins, though? That's what I'm getting at.
No, I think Enneagram is depthy, and for my own part, and here's the thing: like I'm in the minority here. I think your Enneagram type, your motive, your desires are fashioned into your soul, and that's part of who you are prior to being born, being actualized. I think God knows who you are and wants to create you prior to your inception, and so two different twins having different Enneagram types is actually something I would expect.
But then also having greater than average correlation on other personality aspects.
No, I get it. I'm just telling you what I would expect on my theory. I'm not a specialist in other theories.
Well, but would your theory also expect on other personality measurements besides the Enneagram? In other words, here's what it sounds to me like you're saying, Jeff, and I say this with the utmost of respect. I say this, I'm not at all trying to be confrontational here, but it honestly sounds to me like you're saying, like you're trying to eat your cake and have it too, which, by the way, is the right way to say that phrase. The other way is backwards. It sounds like you're trying to eat your cake and have it too, because what you're saying is, on the one hand, my metaphysic and my anthropology leads me to expect there to be differences even between twins. But then on the other hand, you're saying, there are also these other tests that show that there is a lot of correlation amongst twins. I don't know how to reconcile those two things.
I mean, you're asking me to speculate because this is not my field. I assume that some of the stuff, and Jay can speak to this, how much of the twin study stuff is nurture. There would obviously be a bunch on that front, and it may be the case that the things that twins do share in common aren't of the motive side of things. So I'm speaking strictly. I have a fairly tight thing that I'm speaking about. And it ends up being, here is your desires and motive. That's where I started. I think that those are fairly foundational, and in my mind, they end up being really at the depthy core of who God made you to be.
Okay, so Jeff, I think that actually is a helpful answer to the question, and I think it helps clarify what I was missing. I think what you're saying is, because the Enneagram isn't about personality altogether, but about one specific facet of personality, namely motivations or drive, desire. It could be that other aspects of personality are much more influenced by upbringing and genetic makeup, and maybe these more foundational aspects of personality are more innate. Is that?
I think that could work.
Yeah, I think that's at least prima facie plausible. Jay, I want to, if it's okay with you, I want to turn in a moment away from the scientific data and start to put you and myself on the defensive a little bit and turn to more anecdotal stuff. But before we do that, Jeff, as I said earlier, I wanted to give you a chance to offer what you think would be good ways to measure and assess and possibly falsify the validity of the Enneagram. So what are some of the kinds of studies you'd like to see researchers do to try and more helpfully and more reliably gauge the validity of the Enneagram?
Yeah, this was in my conversation with Jay earlier this year. This was a place where he really made good points that caused me to have to rethink some stuff, and it had to do with what would be predictable. And I think he's right to say if Enneagram holds as a worthy theory, there's going to be some things that are predictable that we should be able to assess. And I think having sat on that for a while, I do think that that's correct. So
we're making progress, guys. This is beautiful.
A handful of things that I would want to pitch. And again, this comes back to assumptions, and it's again why I'm fairly skeptical about how people are coming to studies, because oftentimes I know how off I am half the time with Enneagram stuff, so let alone other people in 1983. But assuming that someone who is involved in a study spends significant time nailing down their type and underlying motive with a specialist, given that assumption, I think that Enneagram would prove to be very effective at predicting where that person struggles, what their underlying feeling is of anger, shame, or fear, which is common Enneagram talk, the sins that they struggle with most. I think that it would be predictive in the strengths that serve others. I think it'd be predictive in what they commonly avoid most. I think it's specifically when they are unhealthy or immature, I think that it would predict what they fixate on. I think that it would be predictive in terms of how they solve problems and how they connect with the world. I think that it would be predictive in how they react to stress. And I think it would be predictive in how they get what they want. Again, it's the case that Enneagram it's trying to categorize 8 billion people all at once, and we are all incredibly different. So these are massive categories.
Not so different that we can't fit into 9 types, though. I'm just playing around.
Granted, but it's everything that you have ever seen in your entire life is made up of 7 colors. Yeah. There's not one thing you have ever seen that isn't made of those 7 colors.
I would encourage you to use the musical scale analogy, because every color is on a spectrum.
Every music, every symphony, every song you have ever heard has only 12 notes that it can use. And a lot of the songs can't use, 5 of them, or I don't know.
There is one exception, by the way. You can get an infinite number of notes on a trombone. And I know that from personal experience being a trombonist. But anyway, go ahead.
But you see the point that would be something that I would say. I think you would find if you could type people, what you would see is, so if say here are 1,000 people who type as 1s. That's where they landed when doing the assessment. I think their struggles, their strengths, what they avoid, how they fixate on in unhealth, how they solve problems, how they connect with the world. These would all have a much higher degree of commonality to folks in other camps.
All right. Well, Jay, if you don't mind, in the interest of time, I'm going to try and speed us along now and move us ahead. And I want to put the scientific aspect aside now that we've covered it, because throughout that conversation, I kind of perceived it more like you, and to a certain extent myself, on the offensive, and Jeff a little bit on his heels on the defensive. But I want to switch that around. I want to flip-flop that orientation, because, Jeff, it seems to me, and when I use the word anecdotal, I'm not trying to be derogatory. It's just that it seems to me, based on what I've heard you talk to Jay about previously in the Facebook conversation, I get the impression that the reason that you are such a big fan of the Enneagram is because of what you've seen it accomplish in people's lives, many people's lives, including your own, rather than because of any scientific data one way or the other. So I want to give you a few minutes to, without mentioning any names, give us some real-life examples of how you've seen people's lives improved, even transformed, through working with the Enneagram.
Yeah, there's countless stories. There's a reason that some books on Enneagram sell millions of copies. Is it actually seems to have something that folks truly connect to. You can name that. What is it that they're connecting to would be valuable. But for myself, I have let me use my Christian faith, since we all share this. I have a Christian faith that entails a metaphysical idea about how reality is structured, has an ethical element to it of how one should live their lives. That is important to me, and I don't know that there's any other evidences for me holding Christianity aside from what you were saying before, anecdotal. I come to the world, I experience the world. It seems to me, in my experience of the world, I experience a God who identifies God's self as Jesus, and I experience a community in which that comes forth. Nearly the same kind of experience I have in terms of Enneagram, but it's not about metaphysics or ethics. It's about my motive. And so I have an empirical experiences of myself and others, using this sort of idea, and it just seems to make sense of much of where we're at and how we're moving through life. And it's proven itself over and again to be predictive and really valuable, just in the same way that I experienced Christianity. So I could tell you countless stories on that front, but here would be just a single one. My wife, my youngest son, and myself all share numbers that are different, but they all have the same problem-solving strategy. We all shut down our emotions and we try to solve the problem competently. My oldest does not. My oldest has a number that solves problems emotionally. Just knowing that has been a lifesaver in our family, because the three of us quickly gang up on the one who's emotional with this is how you should think about things, whereas they want their emotions validated, and that's what we should expect given their types. I didn't know anything about problem solving when we've been navigating things, but recently we've stumbled across that element of the Enneagram and said, that's exactly what goes on in our house. This is why this goes on in our house. And that would be one of countless examples that I could use for how helpful it can be and where it's proven itself to be predictive.
Gotcha. And not just improving in minor ways, but really having really profound improvements in people's lives and interpersonal relationships, things like that. Just in terms of its tool, I have somebody who's I'm very, very close to, who tried to commit suicide recently. We started going to lunch recently, 2 or 3 times a week. All I do is bring an Enneagram book and we read through their type. We get normally 3 or 4 sentences in, and they just begin talking about themselves and their inner life. And that has been incredibly healing for them, given where they're at. Yeah. So it's almost, you could say it's saved lives. Which is a data point that in itself has got to be considered. So, Jay, let's turn to that data point now. You've argued, we've just had a drawn-out argument about it, and you've talked about it at greater length in your blog articles, but you've argued that the scientific evidence against the validity of the Enneagram is incredibly strong, and so you've sought to try and explain why there are so many stories like the ones that Jeff has just mentioned with us. And in fact, in your articles, you offer several possible reasons. And I want to begin with the variety of psychological tricks and cognitive biases and things like that you talk about. You mentioned, for example, what you call the Fourier effect. Maybe it's Fourier. I don't know if it's French or not. It also is known as the Barnum effect. And then you've also talked about the DRM procedure. So what are those two things, and how do you think they and things like them might account for some of the Enneagram's popularity?
Yeah, so really kind of the history, again, as I said, of science is that there's so many things that we intuitively believe or that make sense to us that just happen to not be the case. And the ones you mentioned, so the Fourier effect comes from a study done by a psychologist named Fourier, last name Fourier, which is sometimes called the Barnum effect. And what he did is he wanted to disprove astrology. And so he gave his students a personality test, and then the next week he gave them their individualized results. And the results were all the same, but he had them rate how accurate the results were, and on a 6-point scale, so 0 to 5, 39 out of 39 students said it was either 4, 5, or 6, so better than middle range for how well it described them. 38 out of 39 ranked it as either a 4 or a 5, which was very good or perfect description of them. But all these statements were the same for all the students, but they were just very generalized statements, kind of like, I present myself as very confident, but I am really extremely nervous on the inside. So these kind of general, broad statements that kind of or more or less apply to everyone. There were these types of statements that people they certainly did describe the people, but people weren't able to recognize that they describe everyone else as well. And so that's just one. And then the one that you mentioned was the DRM procedure, and I actually did this in my paper as I read my paper, so it's kind of fun to do in an academic setting where normally people are just reading papers. I did a little activity, and in this one I go through and read a list of words, and then asked everyone to remember the words, and then I asked them to write down all the ones that they can remember. Well, all the words have to do with one theme, and that theme is not on the list. So the one I read, that all had to do with the word window, but window was not on the list. But sure enough, about 80% of the people remember window as being on the list. And some people will even argue with me, especially when I do it on a slide. I put the list up at the end, and they're like, but look, it's right there. And I click the thing, and it slowly disappears with the animation. Like, oh crap! And I'll go back through the list backwards, and even give them the clicker because they don't believe it. So give them the clicker and let them go through, and it's not there. But there's tons and tons and tons of these instances where people think there's some sort of effect, and it's not. It's a placebo effect. It's a misperception. It's something that's just been accepted uncritically. And astrology is one example. Studies looking at the effects of sugar and hyperactivity with kids. There's several studies on this. My favorite one, they put kids in a room and gave them cake and told the parents that half the parents your kid had sugar, half the kids that your kid had cake without sugar, and asked the moms to rate their kids' behavior. Well, none of the kids actually got cake with sugar in it. They all had fake sugar in the cake. So they all had the same thing. Well, the moms who thought their kids got sugar rated their behavior as more hyperactive than it really was, compared to the moms who didn't think their kids got sugar, and compared to blind observers who didn't know either condition. We see the same thing with the Mozart effect. So the idea that playing Mozart for your kids will make them smarter, and that sold millions of copies of different books and spawned the whole baby Einstein thing and all this thing. But again, as psychologists actually test it, there's no effect. It's not a real thing. The belief that stress causes ulcers, again, was disproven. It's largely caused by bacteria. And the researcher who actually found this and discovered it actually had to go so far to convince other doctors, because they wouldn't look at the evidence. He drank a vial of the bacteria and then gave himself antibiotics. So he developed the ulcers and gave himself the antibiotics to show like the antibiotics solved the problem. And it wasn't stress. And not to say stress has no effect, but it does have some, but the primary cause is the bacteria. There's case after case after case of these different things where we see an effect, we think there's something there, but it's not. It's a placebo. So it's working because we think it's working, or we misperceive something, or we misjudge something, or we're just basing it off our intuition and not a careful, controlled description of what's happening. We're not recording things. I'd be willing to bet Jeff hasn't gone down and taken copious notes about pros and cons of what he's seen when he's seen his theories confirmed and when he's seen them disconfirmed. It's just a focus on the positive, and we kind of forget the parts that don't fit our theories. It's a normal, regular thing. Is how we function and how we get through life, and it helps us in most cases. But it also can lead us astray.
That's all colored with assumption, though. Yeah, I mean, it just is. You're assuming that all of these psychological effects apply to to people who engage the Enneagram. I could say the exact same thing about Christianity.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second, though, Jeff. I mean, in defense of Jay, I don't think he's saying this is clearly the explanation, and he's assuming that it is. I think what he's saying is he's convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the scientific data has fairly well established that the Enneagram isn't valid, that its claims don't hold up. And so what he's doing here is saying, on the assumption that my assessment of the scientific data is accurate and that the scientific data itself is accurate, how then can I explain the fact that so many lives have been profoundly changed by use of the Enneagram? And he's offering this as one of several possible explanations for why that is. He's not assuming that that's the case. He's just saying that if the scientific data has ruled out that there's something real here, well, then maybe this is one of the things to explain it.
Jay, do you know that there's something? Do you know that the Enneagram has been disconfirmed as a worthy theory of human motive?
So I know you're a philosopher, and I've been through enough philosophy in my seminary degree. So no has a very specific thing.
It doesn't count as knowledge.
It works different within science. So when I am grading my students' papers, and they love to use the word proven. This study proved this. We don't prove things scientifically. We accumulate and we build evidence. And so I would say the evidence for or against the Enneagram is strongly stacked against it. Do I know that for sure? No, maybe it could change, but until the evidence does swing the other way, I'm going to say that it's not reliable and not accurate. And
in your opening claim, and I keep coming back to this, your opening claim was there are very few peer-reviewed articles on this material. You think that's enough to constitute that kind of assessment?
So there's few peer-reviewed articles, but there are a whole bunch of thesis and dissertation projects that have been done on it. So that expands. A lot of those typically will get published. I don't know why they weren't in these cases.
Of language that's out there, you think that it constitutes a body of work to disconfirm, to spend, I mean, so for example, like you spend a lot of energy pitching this, when for somebody like myself, and I'm coming in saying, holy cow, this is immensely valuable to me. That seems like a lot of work that you're going through to seek to disconfirm it based on very few peer-reviewed articles and the couple of papers.
So again, going both directions. So both the evidence that I've cited directly with the Enneagram, but also these other explanations as far as what might be going on as plausible explanations. You put those together, I think it's a really strong case. And then when you add in any sort of negative experience people have had with the Enneagram is another factor to also consider that we haven't even got to yet.
Right? No, that you answered my question. That was my question.
Well, and we will get to the potential harm that it's caused here shortly, because I think Jay is right there that is at least something to consider. But I want to give you a chance, Jay, to just mention a couple of the other proposals that you offer for why the Enneagram might be as popular as it has become and is perceived to have changed so many lives. You mentioned, for example, that it may be that introspection and talking to others about their strengths and weaknesses has helped people, and it just happened that the Enneagram was sort of the catalyst for moving them to do so. And you suggest that perhaps many of those who turn to the Enneagram are those who happen to be in the most need of real change, and by virtue of that fact are likely to improve by just about any means, Enneagram or otherwise. And then, of course, you mentioned the possibility of mere coincidence. So do you want to unpack those things a little bit more before I turn to Jeff? Are these, how are these other plausible explanations for why the Enneagram might seem to work, even if it's not in fact working in the way that it's claimed to?
Yeah, so one thing that psychologists who do therapy, they know it's pretty well established that if a patient or a client, I guess you call them, a client comes in with depression, if you do absolutely nothing, they're going to get better. Why? Because they're there for therapy for depression because they're at a very low point. And so just progression over time, they're almost certainly going to regress to the mean. You know, we have natural ups and downs in life and all kinds of things. And so when they're there for therapy for depression, you don't have to do anything. They're probably going to get better. And so you have to test any sort of treatment you come to or you want to use for therapy for depression against just a control group who's not doing anything to see if they're improving at a higher rate or better than people who do nothing, because there's going to be that natural just regression to the mean or use of trying other things. And so the other one is misattributing the success of something to the Enneagram. Maybe what I just mentioned, but it may be that, let's say I'm sick and I go to the Whole Foods aisle and get some sort of pill, some largely discredited pill that's supposed to make me better, but I also rest and sleep in bed and get more sleep and drink lots of fluids and eat healthy and get foods with whole foods with like vitamins and minerals, and I do those types of things, and maybe I take penicillin, if that's something that would be effective. I do all those things, okay. If I just go and say, oh, well, it was the vitamin C that made me better and ignore all the other things, well, the vitamin C may have made me better. It may have played a role in making me better, or it may have actually slowed my progress, but I still got better. If I attribute it to the vitamin C, I'll be wrong because I did all those other things as well. And so I think that's likely what's happening with the Enneagram, at least in some cases, is there might be some other thing going on that would help explain why there might be some growth, assuming there is some actual growth. The other part, as you mentioned, coincidence, I think the Enneagram probably really does describe some people really well. Okay, well, and it may really help some people just by coincidence. That doesn't justify using it and giving concrete, solid advice to millions or billions of people on how it can revolutionize their life and their well-being, because it worked for just some
Jeff
people.
a chance to push back on that, because when the two of you were talking about this on my Facebook post, your proposed explanations for the Enneagram's popularity, assuming that its validity has been ruled out by the scientific data, Jeff, you responded by saying that actually, to the extent that these explanations are plausible, they actually seem to support the case for the Enneagram's usefulness rather than challenge it. Do you want to unpack that for us, or maybe say anything else in response to what Jay has just offered?
I would just, in response, placebo is not what's taking place when somebody's having a conversation about the Enneagram. I don't know if that would be my only thing. If I'm talking to my oldest, and we're working through the fact that they don't want to be controlled, that's a primary for them. My oldest doesn't want to be controlled by others and is aggressive about creating boundaries to keep themselves from feeling vulnerable. That is who they are. Like, that's just core to them. If I pick up an Enneagram book, I see, oh, look, that looks like exactly one of these types. And I could, and I could say that about myself, as I did earlier. Like, I know how self-critical I am. And I pick up an Enneagram book and it's like, oh, okay, well, here's one of the types that this is a primary way that they are in the world. And then I start to talk to my child about what it looks like to allow others into their space, to be more vulnerable in their relationships, and that can be a great good. That's just very different than taking a sugar pill.
How do you know?
Because I'm talking about their actual motives, and working from their actual motives, we are talking through what it means to be a human being and how to function in healthy ways.
Right, but how do you know that? So you're assuming that so I guess when I say placebo, that's assuming that it's helping them get better in some way. So to improve.
I think that's demonstrative.
Okay, so the simple fact that they think it's going to help them.
Mature. I think that it's demonstrable that they're maturing through our conversations.
Okay, but Jeff, this goes to the other analogy that Jay offered of going to get a discredited pill, but experiencing a lot of benefits because of the rest that the person takes as soon as they get back home from the Rite Aid or whatever pharmacies you guys have where you guys are from. So I guess the question I'd be interested in, Jeff, is how do you know, or in your thinking, does it even really matter whether the reason for the benefit in your oldest is because you talked through these things and helped to identify these core drives, versus it actually being that he is one of these 9 types that everybody is allegedly innately one of, right? How do you know that it's not just the former and it's actually the latter, or does that even really matter?
I mean, there's 2 things going on, I suppose, in my language. One is that Enneagram's the theory about human motive that lines up with how the human psyche exists across nations. And then there's just Enneagram's a tool, and it's a helpful tool. So how do I know that this hammer helped me build the house? Well, I was there when I was building the house, and this hammer was a tool I used to get the nails in. That's all it was I know, not through any experience of my own, but through the literature, that my child actually feels vulnerable and needs to hear from me, I will not betray you. I wouldn't have known that, but I come to our relationship and I speak that over them, and it's immediate how powerful it is in their space, their life, and the connection that we have. That seems to me to be predictive. It seems to be powerful. It seems to be a tool that's being used in ways that are constructive. And again, I can speak to maturation. And I could share that same story with 20 other people. 20 other people who I know, after doing work, this is how they're coming to the world, where they struggle, the messages that they need to hear, and what it has looked like for other people with their type to get more healthy. And it's over and over and over again.
Okay, but I'm just spitballing here, and Jay, I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time here, but I'm just spitballing. It seems to me like, let's say you're faced with two hypothetical options. One, you could take an Enneagram book to your eldest and have the kinds of conversations that you had that resulted in you finding out what your oldest's motivations are, and how speaking "I will never betray you," how impactful that was. You get all of that from the Enneagram book. It has that effect. But let's say that the other hypothetical scenario is knowing that people are simply motivated by different motivations, knowing that for some people hearing that kind of thing is going to be really crucial. But without any respect to the Enneagram, or there being 9 types, or their wings, or their stress lines, and their security lines, putting all that aside, if you just had a book that said, here are a number of different ways that people are motivated, talk to people that are close to you and find out what motivates them, see if maybe they're one of these people who fears that they might be betrayed and would be very benefited by hearing "I will never betray you." The second option comes without all the trappings of the Enneagram, the 9 types, etc., but it seems to get at the very same thing that is causing you to praise the Enneagram so much. So my question is, what does the distinctly Enneagrammic aspects of the Enneagram add to the equation that just talking about the more foundational concepts of motivations and things would not by itself benefit from?
The only thing I'm defending on that front is that it appears to me that there's patterns, and that's all the Enneagram is saying. There's a pattern. There's not there. That when looking for patterns in human motive, nine motives emerge. So that could be falsified. You know, I tend to think that view of reality, that theory, it's an assumption. You just assume it. You swim in it. Does it work? Is it helpful? And it seems, in my experience, it has been as helpful as anything I have ever encountered in terms of relationships in my own inner life. Right. I can't do much more than that.
No, I understand. Well, I'm going to turn back to you now, Jay, for this last segment of our discussion. I've kept you guys for over 2 hours now. I'll try to get us done quickly. If you guys really have to go very, very soon, let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to come back to you, Jay, for... sorry, did one of you say you do have to go? Oh, I thought
I'm great.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll try to get us to this last part quickly. But coming back to the question of potential harm, this might be a good way to transition into this last line of questions, because let's say that Jeff is right, that regardless of whether the pattern and all the aspects of that pattern that the Enneagram captures, regardless of whether that pattern holds up, there does seem to be a lot of fruit being borne by use of the Enneagram. And in fact, your list, Jay, of proposed explanations for why that is sort of assumes that there are a lot of people, maybe not as many as claim to be, but a lot of people who are experiencing positive life change as a result of working with the Enneagram. So then my question is, well, if hypothetically there are multiple ways in which that benefit could be accomplished, the Enneagram being one of them, and perhaps a deficient one, if what we've talked about, the science, proves to be accurate as more and more studies are accumulated, the question would still remain, like, why not go ahead and use the Enneagram, since it is having these benefits, and if there aren't comparable tools that afford the same benefit, but without some of the problems that the Enneagram has. So the question I have for you here is, why does it even matter? If the Enneagram is having positive changes, even though it's not holding up to the scientific data, so what? And one of the reasons that you offer for why it might matter is because you say that there are people who have been harmed by the use of the Enneagram. And going to the hammer and nail analogy that Jeff just offered a moment ago, sure, maybe somebody hitting a nail with a big stone in their hand can get the job done. But what if that's actually causing a lot of construction workers to hurt their thumbs in a way that would not be the case if they were using a hammer? Right? So if there might be other tools that could get the same benefits as the Enneagram but don't have its flaws, well, that might be worth considering. So one of those flaws you've alleged is that there are people who are being harmed by the Enneagram, kind of like the construction worker who hurts his thumb by using a stone instead of a hammer. So what are some examples of ways that the Enneagram appears, on your estimation, to have harmed people rather than helped them?
So I just want to say real quick that I do think it probably has helped some people, but I would also say that it's likely a lot of the positive growth attributed to it isn't really positive growth. It's perceived positive growth. And again, we have lots of examples of this from literature where people perceive some sort of growth or change or ability that they have that isn't so. One of the most interesting, I think, is testing cops' ability to detect lies. And they're very confident that they are good lie detectors, but when compared to college students, they don't do any better. But they think they're better. Right, so they think they're doing this, or similar types of things where we see that happening. So I think probably some people it's helping, some people it's not having any effect, some people they think it's helping them but it's really not. But then moving then to the harm, I think there's that part too. So again, if we're going to assume that people are different, and I really think people are different, way more different than the Enneagram gives people credit for, but people are different, people are naturally going to use it in different ways, and we can argue or debate about whether that's more of a correct way to use it or an incorrect way to use it, but we as humans have a very natural tendency to categorize, to stereotype ourselves and other people. There's actually an interesting psychological method or test method. It's called the minimal group paradigm, where researchers will put people together in a group and they'll give them some sort of minimal thing to be agreement on. So a flip of a coin. Oh, you're both heads people versus those tails people, and they don't even have to say versus. Or you're both. You may remember the blue-eyed kid experiment from the 70s that the teacher did with her kindergarten students, where she told some of the students that, okay, all the blue-eyed people are more intelligent, and they started to band together naturally, and then the next day she reversed it and said, oh, I got it wrong, it's all the brown-eyed people, right? So we have this very strong tendency to categorize and stereotype and then make decisions based on that about ourselves or other people. And so some of the harm that can come, either potential or real, because I've talked to people on this other end, is where people get categorized and then discriminated because of their type for it. So, oh, you're that type, and so therefore we don't think you're going to be good for this job, or you're not good for this relationship, or we won't work together, we're not compatible. Or the other pace of maybe people just not finding their type, and so they do the Enneagram, they hear people talking positively about it, but it's not working for them, it doesn't describe them, and so then they don't feel fit in, they don't feel like it describes them, and they're different, so they feel like something's wrong for them. Or in the case of following it, so it works for them, or it seems to describe them, and they follow advice, but maybe the advice isn't very good because it's not based on evidence and testing and empirical evidence. It's just based on, the intuitions or preferences of the person using it, and it gives bad advice. And so I recently had someone email me and talk to me about this, and she was a type 4, and according to the Enneagram Institute and the type that we talked about, it said how type 4s can grow is that they need to get out of their heads and stop having internal conversations in their head, especially negative conversations, and they need to live in the real world. Okay, well, maybe for some negative things that might be generally good, but actually for a lot of people who experience anxiety, who might be very shy, who have had trauma, those internal discussions in their head are actually vitally important for helping them build up the courage or prepare to have actual conversations. And by telling them not to do it, you're taking away a resource that they could use otherwise, or that it might help them to regulate their emotions so that they don't have to have the conversation and flip their lid on their boss or their partner or someone else. And so this advice that's given to help them grow is actually poorly described and not very nuanced, and maybe not even very good advice at all, depending on how you want to take it. And so that can also lead to negative outcomes, but no one's measuring that, and no one's testing that or looking for that, at least in in any of the studies specifically, or larger surveys. And I can tell you from coming out and writing a couple articles about it, I've had several people come and talk to me and confide in me that they have had negative experiences with it, and they didn't feel comfortable sharing that because other people seemed to like it so much they didn't want to feel like they didn't fit in, or they felt like an outcast because of it, and so they didn't want to share those experiences, again, because they just didn't want to upset the group, or they felt like
Jeff,
something was wrong with
it kind
them.
of reminds me loosely of something that I learned early on in my life as a parent. I'm not going to articulate this very well, but I'm going to try. I learned very early on that as parents, and you may be able to relate to this as a parent yourself, we have a tendency to, not an overriding one, not one that we can't avoid, but we have a tendency to sort of stereotype or pigeonhole our children, either because of their birth order. So often you hear about the firstborn being the one who's bossy and authoritative, and the middle one is, the introspective, quiet one or whatever, and then the youngest is the troublemaker or whatever. Or just you see how their personalities develop in their youth, and you end up starting to think, oh, well, he's my cerebral, intellectual one, and this one over here is the fun-loving, athletic one. And the danger of doing that is that when they start to feel like they'll start to feel an artificial pressure to conform to that kind of stereotype or that kind of pigeonholing. And when they don't, it can be really damaging emotionally that, hey, I'm not living up to the expectations. So it sounds to me a lot like that. There's this danger of saying, look, if you tell somebody who, let's say that I have something in me that is very different from what a 3 would say about me, because we talked earlier about how I'm allegedly a 3. If I'm told I'm a 3 and I'm feeling pressure to not challenge the people that I respect who say, yeah, you're a 3 or whatever, or I want to fit in or whatever, I may be neglecting the fact that there are actually things about me that aren't a 3, and that I'm neglecting by pigeonholing myself as a 3. Anyway, do you think that there is a concern there? And if so, how could you mitigate that, if you wanted to continue to use the Enneagram?
Yeah, I think a couple things come to mind here. One, all language categorizes. There's nothing that we have said, not one word we have said in this discussion that doesn't at some level categorize the reality that we encounter. You cannot escape categorization if you are going to communicate. You have a computer. That is that word categorizes some of the matter in your office versus other matter in your office. So just so we know,
Can I say something? Yeah, I say that's absolutely right. I completely agree with that. But it's more about the level of the way in which things are categorized and the specificity, rather than looking at them as being more flexible.
Yeah. I think secondarily, I assume both of you all have a much stronger view of human depravity than I do.
Are you Reformed, Jay? Okay, so I may be
really, but kind of. So that's a different conversation. There's a lot of baggage that comes with saying Reformed or Calvinist that I kind of reject a lot of those
I was just
things that go along with that.
Because Jeff put both of us together as having a stronger view of human depravity. I just guess that's what he was getting at. I am Reformed. I do think we're rotten dirtbags as human beings. But anyway, Jeff, you go ahead. Sorry.
Human beings use very useful tools for terrible things. I can use a hammer to build my house. I can use my hammer to bludgeon my family to death. But, the hammer itself is, I assume, was constructed for good and worthy purposes. So just because the Enneagram can be used for terrible purposes actually shows you the power of the Enneagram. It doesn't really say it, and it tells you perhaps something about the character of people who hurt other people with it. Nearly everything Jay was saying, I found myself thinking this can all be applied to the Bible. It can all be applied to the church. Of course, the Bible has been used to do great damage to human beings. You know it, I know it. We have seen spiritual abuse and its aftermath. We've seen churches who have torn people apart. I don't see how the Enneagram is really different on this front. I think the church is very powerful. The Bible is very powerful, and that's why they can do such damage.
Well, remember though, Jeff, that the context of this part of our conversation is why it matters if the scientific data doesn't support the validity of the Enneagram. In other words, he's not saying,
yeah, well,
huh?
Go ahead. I know. Go ahead.
Okay. So he's not saying, look, because it harms some people, therefore it must be false. I think what he's saying is, because the scientific data doesn't yet, at least, seem to support its legitimacy, then because it also has been abused and has hurt people, maybe we should be withholding support for it until such time as that scientific data is available. Because here's the thing, you're absolutely right, Jeff, about the Bible and about the church. But the reason why we know, or at least the reason I think I know, that the Bible is true despite, and is of divine origin, despite the fact that people have abused it. The reason I believe in the church, despite the fact that the church does a lot of things wrong, is because I see what I think is the evidence, not anecdotal evidence in terms of, well, I've seen it work in people's lives. No, I've seen people who give it up, who give Christianity up because it doesn't seem to work for them. No, the reason why I believe in the Bible, despite the fact that it's abused at times, is because I think I see the evidence supporting it. The scientific, historical, archaeological, etc. evidence backing it up. Whereas it sounds like what Jay is saying is, well, we don't have that same kind of evidentiary support for the Enneagram, so why go around swinging it like a club before knowing that it's a club that we ought to be swinging around? Because that club does sometimes hurt people. I think that's what he's getting at. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Because it saves people from suicide. Because it saves churches. Because it saves families from falling apart. Because it's powerful. It's really powerful, and it can be used horribly. Being a specialist in this material myself, I can use it as a weapon. Now, a lot of people don't have, or people who gain hold of it, like, imagine somebody who has an AR-15 and they don't know how to use it. You can do great damage with it. It's a very powerful weapon. You know, there are all sorts of instances of powerful things being used for terrible purposes. I realize what Jay is saying is there's not enough scientific evidence to back it up, and therefore when we see damage, that's a horrible story. Well, there's all sorts of assumptions being taken place there, which is really where we should be debating. Is like, how do we come to this in terms of what evidence counts for Enneagram, and what's the state of the present evidence? I think we came to an agreement on this, and so now we're just telling a story about, let's assume that it's all false. Look at all the damage it's done. And if you assume it's false, then of course I would go with you there.
No. I don't think that's quite a fair way of putting it. But I just want to say this, and Jay, I'll turn back to you. I'm sorry I keep stealing your thunder, but I remember very early on in my ministry, I interviewed a guy, and Justin Peters. He is a paraplegic or quadriplegic, I think. I think he has cerebral palsy or something like that. Anyway, he's a really excellent. He's got an excellent ministry, I think. And one of the things that he deals with are people who have been absolutely devastated by the word faith movement, because there are people who are suffering really severe illnesses and other kind health concerns, and they go to one of these tent meetings and they're told, you just believe strongly enough, you just have enough faith and give me enough money and you'll get healed of your thing. And you know what? There are a lot of people who say that they experience profound life change and improvement as a result of buying into that stuff. But there's certainly no evidence in support of that, and it has hurt people. So
it just comes back to the factual question. My claim has been there's not enough proof on the scientific side. I don't think that the assessments have been done.
Okay.
That's my only claim. Here's the thing. If the experiential evidence counts.
Sure.
You believe in the resurrection because of experiential evidence and not because of science. You do. Mm-hmm. You're basing it on testimonies. Sometimes that matters and counts as proof.
Well, evidence.
Yeah.
So I would say the scientific evidence, like we can look at, and so even psychologically, the limits of memory errors that can be attributed to the resurrection and how stories do or don't change over time. Like we have scientific evidence for that, and I don't think those can explain the resurrection.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misheard you.
So psychologists study memory. They study, okay. So there is evidence for that to support the resurrection, I would say, and not evidence.
Scientific evidence for the resurrection.
Depending on how you consider that, yes. So there have been medical studies that look at the description of how Jesus died, and they have a pretty good idea of how he actually died and what happened internally. And so when his side was pierced with a spear, we have medical evidence for that to show that he died and that it was an accurate description of how he died. We know enough about how memory works and kind of the memory errors and biases that we have. So when I talked about the DRM procedure, like what are kind of the limits of that, and like no one claims that there was 12 planes at 9/11 or that people from 9/11 were resurrected, right? So we know the limits on those memory errors, and they don't match up with what we see described in the Gospels about Jesus and what we have from Paul's account. And so what we know scientifically, if we accept what we know scientifically about what would have happened then and how our memory works and what biologically is described happening, it can't explain the resurrection a different way. You have to change the evidence in order to explain it away. I don't think that's the case here with the Enneagram. And so when we talk, as usually when you take like an intro to statistics class or research methods, they talk about reliability and validity of different tests using like a target. And so you think of reliability of, are you hitting the target in the same place consistently? That's reliability. That's what we talked about a little bit today. And validity is more, are you actually hitting the target they're aiming for, or are you hitting a different target? So you can have, you want to look at both reliability and validity. And so as you mentioned in AR-15, Jeff, right, and a weapon is only good as the person using it or what they're using it for. But imagine you're using an AR-15 that is always missing the target. You don't know, you can't predict where it's going to shoot, even if you're a marksman. It's just not reliable. Are you going to use that rifle still? Probably not. It might work. You might shoot it at, say, a dog charging after your kid when you live somewhere and completely miss, but the sound scares off the kid or scares off the dog. Or you shoot it at something very precise, and every once in a while you hit the thing you're trying to do, and it's helpful, right? But you're still not going to use it, at least in any situation where you could hit another person, because you don't know if it's going to be right or wrong. You don't have a good estimate of whether or not it's going to do good, or it's going to be neutral, or it's going to do damage. And I said that would be more like the Enneagram isn't more about a tool that's being used. It's a tool that's inaccurate that's being used. And so we can't really predict what the outcome is going to be when it's being used.
Jeff?
I mean, there's obviously a lot going on there. I'll let you. I'm going to set the Jesus resurrection side of things to the side for a minute. There's an assumption that we obviously are having a disagreement on whether or not the Enneagram itself is a valuable, valid tool. So I certainly, and I granted this earlier, if it were the case that it's not, that I believed it wasn't a valuable, valid tool, then I think that I would probably come down on to where you're at, where you can say this invalid tool is doing great damage. It would be like it would be similar to how I look at other, religions. I don't think religion X is a true metaphysical description of reality. It does some great good. It may start some wars over here, but this is how the world works. I think it really comes back around to people. People are awful and can do awful things, and it really says more about the people than it does about the tool. I don't see the tool doing the damage that you do, and I'm inundated. I mean, I'm swimming in these waters all the time. So, but that's my limited experience. So,
but do you think someone who is feeling harm from it, or feels like it doesn't describe them very well, or is skeptical about it, would feel comfortable telling you that?
It depends on the person. We've had this conversation. I understand how discouraging that could be. I think it would be really discouraging if everybody else is figuring out, look, this is where I land on your system, and a person is saying, I really don't connect with any of these types. That strikes me as being highly discouraging. And I've shared my stories. I have friends who have advanced degrees in psychology, who I go around those circles all the time with them, because now we laugh at it. But I could see that they may feel inadequate, or like they don't fit, or something like that. I get that. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, there's all sorts of places where in life itself where you kind of can feel like an outsider.
All right. Well, guys, I don't want to cut things short, 2.5 hours, without covering anything that either of you had really, really hoped to cover. Is there anything more that you guys would like to cover that we haven't, or can we start to wrap things up?
The only thing that I'll go first. That's all right.
Please.
I'll let you have the final word here, Jay. There are all sorts of things that are so valuable to our experience that just aren't empirically verified or discovered or proven. Most of ethics, you don't prove what's right and wrong, good and bad through empirical study. You don't prove the meaning of life through empirical study. That's repeats. You don't prove the value of love and self-sacrifice through empirical study. You don't prove most of the arguments, especially the good arguments for God's existence, aren't scientific in nature in my mind. And I think if you believe in the soul or the mind, I think those are going to be non-scientific proofs. They're going to be other sorts of proofs: historic proofs, existential proofs, proofs about that are aimed at, this is how I encounter the world. And so that's not to diminish science, but it is one of those things that I think is part of our conversation, that somehow the only evidence that counts for Enneagram is what is scientifically verifiable. And I think that's a bad way to go, especially when talking about your psyche, which, again, in my mind, my assumption, I think most Christians would believe that you have an immaterial element to yourself. You don't have to, Chris.
I know.
But I think
I know I'm in a small minority. I get it.
So if you have an immaterial element to yourself, that you need to take into account, immaterial things are not scientifically dissected. So let's just be aware that that's the topic on the table. We're talking about your inner life, which isn't something that you can hold up and say, here, this is my inner life. It's just not that kind of thing. So that would be my take.
Jay, do you want to?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I would say that a lot of that, I agree with in some ways, but not in others. And so, again, we don't prove things scientifically, but the things that are scientifically testable, we should test scientifically. And the things that you mentioned, maybe not completely scientifically testable, but have scientifically testable parts to it. So, for instance, the value of love and meaning of life and virtue and ethics. The lab that I work in is called the Science of Virtues Lab. That's what we do. We scientifically test virtues. And how do we do that? We're not scientifically testing to say this is virtue or this isn't. We're building on a lot of philosophy and theology for that, but we're testing the outcomes of it. So we say, well, right now I'm working on a grant with gratitude to God. We're saying it's a virtue. You want to have the right amount of gratitude in the right way. Okay, well, what are the outcomes? Does it have positive outcomes or negative outcomes that are associated with that? Can we test that? Do we get consistent results when we test it? And we find that it does. And whether we think it's an immaterial soul or material soul, it's still coming and having its outworking, and there's still going to be material behaviors that go along with it that, again, we can test. And so all of that does have an empirical, scientifically testable side to it that comes out and should hold up to scientific scrutiny when it's tested that way.
Gratitude is good. You believe that? What possible evidence, scientific evidence, could you give for the claim gratitude is good?
So people who have higher levels of gratitude typically have higher levels of subjective well-being. They're typically happier, which sometimes scholars will draw a distinction there. Sometimes they say the same thing. They tend to be more pro-social and have better relationships with other people. They tend to donate more money.
Float the punchline. you're begging the question, because now you're saying subjective well-being is good, happiness is good. Where's the goodness? Where's the goodness? Scientifically discovered.
That's that part that we don't test scientifically, that I said we're building on philosophy and theology. And so you say, okay, well, where's the goodness with the Enneagram? And again, we test it and we can define what's good. Okay, let's come up with our idea of what's good and then test it, but the Enneagram's not meeting that because we can't even get consistent types. It's saying the Enneagram's saying there's types, but we're not even getting consistent types. So how can we say it's good? You know, here's what's good for type 1s to do if there's not really such a thing as a type 1.
I mean, we're just going back to the circle. Both of us said that, and alongside Dr. Daniels, there's not enough literature out there in my mind. So I hear your frustration there. I think you want to critique the system, and perhaps rightly so. And I want to just say, just as a practitioner, I just don't think there's enough out there to say much about it. When talking about goodness, the nature of goodness is not physical. Goodness itself isn't anything discoverable in the universe. Goodness is a concept. It's a moral value judgment. And you cannot, the famous idiom from David Hume is you can't derive an ought from an is. Just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be that way. There's a fundamental misstep there. When you said part of your study then goes into theology and philosophy, that's exactly it. You're moving out of the sciences. And so my claim was that we're talking about the inner life, and the inner life may not be material.
But the inner life, that may be the case. But the inner life is embodied. And by definition, I mean, even if I assume the substance dualist hat that I used to wear, the soul is embodied. And so we can, although we don't have direct access, external access anyway, to a person's soul, we can measure how that inner life works itself out through its embodied, the material body that embodies it. And
I'm saying that it's enormously complicated.
Well, sure.
If you don't think, because otherwise you, I don't know if Jay believes this. Do you believe that all of your thoughts, feelings, emotions reduce to chemical activities in your brain and atomic particles slamming into one another?
I do, but I don't think that's necessary for this argument.
See, I don't even say that.
Either way, the soul is working through the brain.
Fully determined by physics, that you have no volition. You think you have no free choice.
I think you probably believe that if you were pressed on it.
I don't believe that because I think there's an immaterial side of myself. This actually is interesting because there's no reason for us to debate. You are entirely conditioned by your environment to believe this. There's not anything that I could possibly do.
Wait. I want to make sure, Jeff and Jay, I want to make sure before we make such a big deal out of this sudden bomb that got dropped on us in the 2 3/4 hours into our discussion, I want to make sure that we are all saying the same thing. So, Jay, just in case it's not clear, and it probably is, you're brilliant, but just in case it's not clear, what Jeff is asking you is, are you what would be called a naturalistic determinist, meaning that your actions, your thoughts, your feelings are entirely and reducibly simply the result of the next effect in a chain of cause and effect, biological, biochemical, physical cause and effect stretching back to the Big Bang, such that if you had a powerful enough computer and you had all the variables that were in play at the very beginning, you would be able to literally calculate what every single person would do throughout all time simply by virtue of the fact that our mind states are just the effect, the last effect in a series of chain and cause and effect. Because here's the thing, even as a physicalist, I don't believe that. I'm a non-reductive physicalist, meaning that I think that the causal relationship between brain and mind is bidirectional, not unidirectional. So I think the mind that is the product of the brain can in turn affect changes in the brain. But it sounds like you're going even further than that, if I'm hearing you correctly. So would you characterize your view as that kind of materialistic determinism? Even though you're a Christian, you're not a materialist. Nevertheless, you think that your mind states are simply the product of a chain of cause and effect stretching back to the Big Bang?
So I would probably be best described as a soft theistic
that's
determinist.
compatibilism, but that...
And I make that distinction. Well, it's a little different because, let's say, even if we have a soul, where I'm agnostic on, that soul, whatever it thinks and feels and does, has to have some sort of cause and effect related to it as well. So God caused our soul to exist. What he put into that soul in the initial conditions or whatever conditions affect the way that we think and work and feel. And that's why I think it's kind of an irrelevant point, because either way, our soul is functioning in a way in which it was designed.
All right.
I mean, the nature of your soul would matter to our discussion, yeah.
Through our... Well, I don't think it so matters, because even if we have this soul that is separate from our brain, and that's the driving force, it's still, our soul, as you say, has these motivations and desires that are at its core. Then if my soul has certain desires and motivations that are different than yours, then we should be able to test those effects and say, well, because I'm motivated to know the right answer for things, I'm going to act in a way that gets me to right answers. And if you are motivated to just have autonomy, or I think you used that example with your son, right? He's going to act in a way, right, physically, in a way that seeks and desires and tries to get autonomy. So the effects, and that's what we're testing, is those effects. So either way,
yeah,
I'm talking about is those effects.
Again, I'm concurring with you in part, because I gave a big list of here's where I think you could do some scientific study on Enneagram. But secondarily, I do think that, do you think you can scientifically assess the behavior of God?
What do you mean by that?
God does things. Can you scientifically assess God's behavior?
Well, Jeff, if I might,
psychological methods.
So are you talking like the teleological argument? Like, we know, so the Bible tells us God is rational and God is good, right? And so from that, we kind of derive, well, it would make sense that we live in an ordered universe that's not chaotic, that's predictable, and that's kind of the foundation for the
God
design
has
argument.
Behavior. God does stuff in the world. Can you scientifically assess God's behavior?
Yeah, God acts in the world. I'm not sure.
My point would be something like this. You and I are made in the image of God. There is an immaterial aspect to us that reflects the living God. All I'm saying is that if you can't assess God's behavior thoroughly with just science, there may be elements to our lives that aren't scientifically assessed. It might be the case that the sort of evidences that I feel like have been really put down, that is existential experience, empirical, the experiences we have in our heads of our own lives, in relationship, those evidences I think have been thrown out the window. And I think that those are immensely important to being a human being and to having our experiences in the world. All the things are granted in terms of people, self-deception really exists. And people do all sorts of kooky things, when they believe false things. All that's granted, but it's still the case. I love my kid, and that's not something that can be scientifically verified. It just can't.
Why can't it?
How would you do it?
We know that love, the feelings of love, come from high levels of oxytocin and vasopressin.
Do you think the love you have for your wife is entirely chemically induced?
I don't know, but I know it can be tested chemically, because whatever the soul may cause that has chemical signatures.
This for just my state of mind, I find that a repugnant conclusion. I find the idea that the care that I have for other human beings is reducible.
No, Jeff,
to
that's not fair.
emotions.
That's you literally just said what he denied. He said, no, I don't assume that my love is reducible to chemistry. He just said that.
Okay, well, then it would verify the point I was making.
Well, but no, because what he's saying is that whatever that love ultimately is, it manifests with scientifically measurable phenomena like those
Yeah.
chemicals. So even though,
Okay,
so
so
even
no,
though it's not
so the question
you
is
can't
how-
exhaustively test it empirically, you can at least somewhat.
That is entirely my point. You can't exhaustively test all things scientifically.
Okay, but I don't think that Jay has ever suggested otherwise.
Well, then let's just mark that down as something we all agree on.
Woo! All right, we did it.
To everything that we've said over the last 3 hours, because it would have huge effect in terms of, if I could bring that up over and over again, it would have been a counter argument to many of the claims being made.
So let me ask you this then. Do you believe that we misinterpret things, that we misidentify things, that that the placebo effect is real, that we have
Absolutely.
memory errors, those types
We
of
come
things?
back to the resurrection
Okay, so
on
then-
some of that too. I mean, you can't have it both ways on some of this. But go ahead. But yeah, I
Right,
absolutely
but again, as we know those things, we can know the limits of them. But if you're not so if you admit those things, right, then how do you know those aren't the things that are happening in your experience with the Enneagram?
So this is a common question in philosophy. How do you know that you're not crazy? How do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that you're not in the matrix? How do you know that your brain doesn't function abnormally, but it appears like it does? I mean, I'm not looking for that kind of proof.
Test it.
I'm grabbing hold of theories that make sense of my experience, and I'm elevating them because they bring beauty and goodness and human flourishing to my experience. And I want to name them and say, I love the Lord Jesus because that's my experience. In a different, it's not the same at all in some ways, but it is very similar, saying the Enneagram has just been one of those things that's brought a lot of value to my life, and I'm holding it up. All I can do with my experience is have experiences and then enjoy them. And if I saw things that, like, I read every article that you footnoted, and I was like, okay, I don't think this disproves the theory for the reasons that I said. But
so I guess what would you tell someone who makes all the claims you made about astrology?
Say to the person who makes all those about Christianity?
I would go through all the different lists of both philosophical, scientific, and historical evidence.
What if somebody rejects all of your evidences?
Well, of course you can.
Where we're at.
Well, of course you can't make every horse that you bring to water drink it, Jeff. The question isn't what are you going to do if they reject your evidence. We're just saying that evidence is at least there, but we're saying we're not even seeing that evidence with the Enneagram.
I'm saying that the studies haven't been done. That's been the primary claim, and it was the very first thing that Jay said. There haven't been enough. There have been very few of these studies.
I want to play the tough moderator and put an end to this because we're approaching 3 hours, and I'm starving. I haven't eaten dinner yet. So listen, here's what I want to do as we start to wrap up. And by the way, if you guys want to come back for a round 2 at some point, I'd welcome that if there's more to be said. So we'll keep in touch about this. But let's start to wrap up with 2 things. Firstly, I like to give my guests an opportunity to offer something of a parting message. Something that, look, we've been talking for 2 3/4 hours, and a lot of time, some of the things we've been talking about are just whoosh, flying over a lot of people's heads. So a lot of what we've said is going to get forgotten about. And what I want you guys to do is each of you in turn offer something of a parting message, something that you'll hope that viewers will be thinking about after this conversation's over, even if they forget everything else. So, Jay, why don't you go first, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so I read a recent study that age 14 is the prime age for kids to believe in conspiracy theories. And I just happen to have a 14-year-old daughter. And recently the topic of conversation with her has been aliens and ghosts and things she picks up from her friends about that. And just today when I picked her up from school, as we're driving home, she was talking to me about ghosts and telling me these stories about her friends who've seen ghosts. And she's pressing me again and again, well, what if you saw a shadow and you're in the middle of nowhere and it was this shadow and there was nothing blocking the light anywhere and it wasn't your shadow because it was a different place, and all all these different ways, and I explained to her like what I would think and how we misperceive things and all that. And she's like, well, what if that didn't happen and this didn't happen? And over on these different ways to try and avoid the empirical kind of claims or criticism of that belief. And I bring that up to make the point of the things that we believe and what we think is true or good, we should be consistent. So the way that we evaluate claims of UFOs and ghosts, or essential oils, or as you titled this, snake oil, amber beads. I know, Chris, I saw a video of you working out, and within the fitness community, there are tons and tons of misinformation about, use this supplement and use it that way, and here's a special place where you can get it, and it's the good stuff, not that, right? And so there's all these things, and right, and so all these different things that can go on, like, we should be consistent in the way that we test them and hold them up to scrutiny of evidence. And the Enneagram is just one of those. Be consistent in the way that we approach that. Right now, the evidence doesn't seem to support it. It basically is showing that the types really don't exist in a firm way. There's not really clear delineation between the types, not to mention the triads and the wings. And then on top of that, the effects aren't really well supported, and so that's where we are now. Even if there is limited evidence on it, that's where we are, and we have evidence or other reasons why it would seem to work, even if it doesn't. And so until there's better evidence from things like this being tested, I would say we should admit that it's not accurate and it's not reliable. Whether you use it, that's a different question, but we should admit where it is now and say, well, maybe one day it'll be better, and then come back to it at that point.
All right, thank you for that. Jeff, same thing to you. A parting message you'd like something people to be thinking about, even if they forget most of everything else we've been talking about.
First, many thanks to you, Chris. You moderated this perfectly.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It means a lot.
I always really enjoy.
I want to say, Jeff, that means a lot to me, not just in general because I want to be that kind of interviewer, but also because, number one, I was already more on Jay's side than yours on this topic, and so I wanted to make sure I was as fair as possible. But number two, you and I sometimes butt heads on Facebook. We don't, there's some areas where we have some strong disagreements, and I didn't want that to color the way I treated you. So it just means the world to me that you feel that way about my moderation. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I prefer spirited discussions and debates. I know that for Jay, what I hear consistently is just a real strong elevation of I want data in order to engage the world, which would, by the way, point to the Enneagram type that we've talked about in the past that you think you are, which we could talk more about that in terms of that. I think underlies a lot of the motive you have in propelling your argument, and I deeply respect that. It is not my motive, and I end up. Go ahead.
Just one though. I would say that's just one of my types. Maybe. Though I would say.
I think that if it were the case that you ended up typing as a 5, I think there's a lot to say in terms of how your motive colors how you're coming to the topic itself, and so, but. I always really appreciate you. I feel like you always treat me with gentleness and grace, and I'm grateful. The thing for me ends up being, for anyone who's still watching, Enneagram has just been incredibly helpful for me. I personally don't like country music. I might even make some arguments about how country music makes the world worse. But there are some folks that really get into country music and it makes their lives better. And on for now, until the scientific evidence is in, I'm labeling Enneagram in that camp of it actually has done a lot of good for a lot of people. I don't see the huge negatives that are potentially there, although anything that has power can be weaponized. So if you want to get into your inner life, if you want a tool that's going to help move your relationships forward, and in my experience, a tool that helps connect me to God more, the Enneagram has been fantastic for me on those fronts. And so that's just my personal experience.
For whatever it's worth, I largely share your assessment of country music. I think there are some standouts, but overall it's a pretty abysmal genre. All right, last question. for each of you, and we'll go to you first again, Jay. Where would you encourage people to go online to find your work, and also any resources you think might be helpful as they assess the validity of the Enneagram for themselves?
Probably my website or my social media. So website, jaymedinwalt.com. If you Google my name and spell it wrong, it'll still probably get you in the right direction, because everyone always gets it wrong, and that's okay. But yeah, there's not a lot out there that's critical of the Enneagram scientifically based on its accuracy, other than what I'm doing. So if someone knows of something, I would love to see it, because I'm not really aware of it outside what I've done. And I know if you look up, there's a few other people who have come at it from more of a theological perspective to critique it. You mentioned Justin Byerly's show that he had Marsha Montenegro on, and she works with a ministry that does some writing against it. And Sean McDowell semi-recently had someone on his show, his YouTube channel. I think it was Dr. Chris Berg, talking about it from a theological perspective, and so that's another video you could watch. I think he has a book out as well, and so that if you want a little more of the theological perspective, which I tend to think at least some of that critique may be valid, but some might be a little bit overstated. So I think Jeff and I probably agree more there, but I think it's worth at least considering as a piece of evidence to think about, and not just ignore. So yeah, that awesome. Would be about it, I would say.
Jeff, same question to you.
Yeah, the best place to find this work is Around the Circle podcast. It's easy to find. It's everywhere. We have a few thousand listeners, so I'm sure if you do an Enneagram search, or if you look up Around the Circle, you'll find us.
Awesome. Well, again, both of you, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time, not just conducting this discussion for 3 hours, but preparing for it as well. And as I said, if you guys want to do round 2 at some point in the future, or for that matter, discuss anything else that the three of us might be interested in discussing, I'd love to have you back on. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Likewise. Thank you.
Take it easy.
All right, well, that's it, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'll not belabor the point any further, and I'll just wish you a fond farewell. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time, Monday, December 13th, my birthday. Wow, I didn't know I'd be streaming on my birthday. I'll be turning 42 years old. So come back 2 weeks from today, December 13th, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...